The dust had not yet settled upon the valley floor when the first of the messengers rode out from the forward camp, his horse lathered and wild-eyed, carrying the sealed dispatch that bore the personal insignia of Sultan Arhin Sahib toward the distant walls of the palace. The rider tore through the forest with the desperate, reckless speed of a man who understood that the words he carried were not mere ink upon parchment, but the living, breathing pulse of a nation's fate. And as the branches whipped across his face and the hooves of his mount pounded the ancient earth like the heartbeat of the land itself, behind him the army continued its slow, grinding reorganization, the machinery of war shifting gears from the chaos of combat to the meticulous, painstaking work of consolidation and preparation. Arhin Sahib had not slept, he had not eaten. He had not allowed himself the luxury of even a moment's rest since the final sword was sheathed, and the last enemy soldier disappeared into the tree line, because he understood with the bone-deep intuition of a born commander that the hours immediately following a victory were the most dangerous of all, the hours when exhaustion bred complacency, when the intoxicating wine of triumph dulled the senses and blinded the eyes to the thousand small threats that gathered in the shadows like jackals waiting for the lion to close its eyes. He moved through the camp with a tireless, watchful energy that seemed to defy the limitations of his battered, bleeding body, checking defenses, inspecting wounded, conferring with scouts, and above all, projecting the calm, unshakable presence of a sovereign who was fully in command of both his army and himself, a presence that radiated outward from his person like warmth from a forge fire, steadying the nerves and stiffening the spines of every man who came within its reach. Tarhin had departed at first light with a hand-picked company of 20 riders, the finest horsemen and trackers in the Kayı ranks, men whose ability to read the language of the earth, the broken twig, the displaced stone, the faint impression of a hoof in soft soil, bordered on the supernatural. They rode in a loose, spreading formation, covering maximum ground while maintaining visual contact with one another through a system of hand signals and mirror flashes that Tarhin himself had devised during the long, patient campaigns of the frontier wars. Their quarry was Damir Khan and the shattered remnants of his army, a force that Tarhin estimated at no more than 60 to 80 men, weakened, demoralized, and running scared, but still dangerous in the way that a wounded cobra is dangerous, its venom no less lethal for the injuries that had been inflicted upon its body. Tarhin knew that Damir Khan was not a man who would accept defeat gracefully, that his pride, which was as vast and as brittle as a frozen lake, would demand either immediate revenge or a spectacular, self-destructive act of defiance that could drag countless others into the abyss of his ambition. He also knew that Shahanshah, wherever the manipulative ruler had fled, would almost certainly attempt to re-establish contact with Damir Khan, to gather the broken pieces of their alliance and reassemble them into a new and more dangerous configuration. And so the pursuit was not merely a military operation, but an intelligence-gathering mission of the highest importance, designed to map the enemy's movements, identify their allies, and anticipate their next move before it was even conceived. The trail led northeast, away from the valley and toward the dense, uncharted wilderness that lay between the Ottoman territories and the borderlands of the disintegrating Byzantine frontier, a no-man's land of thick forest, treacherous ravines, and isolated villages whose loyalties shifted with the seasons like leaves in the wind. Tarhin's trackers found the signs of Damir Khan's passage easily enough in the first few miles, the retreating army having made no effort to conceal its route in its panicked flight from the battlefield. But as the morning wore on and the terrain grew more rugged, the trail began to fragment, splitting into multiple branches as the fleeing force broke apart into smaller groups, each seeking its own path through the wilderness. Tarhin paused at a crossroads where 3 separate trails diverged, studying the ground with the intense, focused concentration of a man reading a text written in a language only he could understand. The deepest tracks, made by the heaviest horses, led down a steep ravine toward the river crossing at the bottom, a route that offered the fastest escape but also the greatest exposure to ambush. A second set of tracks, lighter and more carefully placed, wound uphill toward a rocky ridge from which any pursuer could be observed for miles. And a third trail, barely visible, marked by only the faintest scuffs and scratches, disappeared into a narrow, overgrown path that led deeper into the heart of the forest, toward the ancient, abandoned fortress of Kara-Hissar, a crumbling ruin that had served as a refuge for bandits, rebels, and fugitives for generations. Tarhin considered the options, his mind working through the strategic calculus with the swift, precise efficiency of a master chess player, and then divided his force into 3 groups, dispatching 5 riders to follow each of the 2 decoy trails while he himself, accompanied by the remaining 10, took the third path toward the fortress, his instinct telling him, with a certainty that transcended logic, that this was where the true quarry would be found. Meanwhile, in a very different arena of conflict, Fatima Hatun and Princess Esportia continued their journey back toward the palace, riding through the morning forest in a silence that was no longer the uncomfortable, weighted silence of strangers forced together by circumstance, but the quieter, more complex silence of 2 women who had glimpsed each other's humanity in the darkness and were still processing the implications of what they had seen. Esportia rode stiffly, her body aching from the fall, her mind a churning sea of conflicting emotions, but there was something different in her bearing now. A subtle, almost imperceptible straightening of the spine, a firmness in her grip on the reins, that suggested the vision in the forest had changed something fundamental within her, had shifted the tectonic plates of her identity in ways that she herself did not yet fully understand. Fatima, riding slightly ahead, kept a watchful eye on the trail and the surrounding woods, her warrior's instincts constantly scanning for threats, but she also found herself glancing back at the princess with increasing frequency, studying her face with the shrewd, appraising gaze of a woman who had learned to read character the way Tarhin read tracks, by the subtle, telling details that most people overlooked. She saw the tear streaks that had dried on Esportia's cheeks, the bruises that mottled her arms, the set of her jaw that spoke not of stubbornness, but of a hard-won, newly forged determination, and she recognized in these signs the same transformation she had witnessed in herself years ago, when the sheltered girl she had once been had been stripped away by the harsh, unforgiving realities of life among the Kayı, leaving behind only the iron core that had always existed within her, waiting to be revealed. It was Esportia who finally broke the silence, her voice small and rough, raw from crying and parched from the long night without water. She asked Fatima why she had come, why she had risked her life riding through the dangerous forest in the dark to find a woman who had caused nothing but trouble for the household. Fatima did not answer immediately, taking a long moment to consider the question, and when she finally spoke, her voice was measured, honest, stripped of all diplomacy and pretense. She told Esportia that she had not come for her sake alone, but for the sake of the Sultan, for the sake of the house, and for the sake of the unborn future that depended on every member of the family standing together rather than scattering to the 4 winds at the first sign of hardship. But then she paused, her expression softening almost imperceptibly, and added in a quieter voice that she had also come because she knew what it felt like to be drowning in a sea of expectations with no hand reaching down to pull you up, and that she would not wish that feeling on her worst enemy, let alone the wife of her sultan. Esportia stared at her, her eyes wide, searching Fatima's face for any trace of condescension or manipulation, and finding none, only the calm, steady gaze of a woman who had spoken the truth and was prepared to let it stand on its own merits. For the first time since her flight from the palace, Esportia felt the knot of tension in her chest loosen, just slightly, just enough to allow a single, shuddering breath to fill her lungs completely, and she whispered a word of gratitude so quiet that it was almost swallowed by the rustling of the leaves, but Fatima heard it, and she nodded once, a small, simple acknowledgement that carried within it the seed of something that had not existed between these 2 women before, not friendship, not yet. But the possibility of it, fragile and tentative as a new shoot emerging from the frozen ground of early spring. They rode on through the brightening morning, the forest gradually thinning as they approached the cultivated lands that surrounded the palace, the wild, untamed chaos of the woods giving way to the orderly, reassuring geometry of plowed fields, stone walls, and irrigation channels that spoke of human industry and the slow, patient conquest of nature by civilization. As they crested the final hill, the palace came into view, its towers catching the morning light and gleaming like polished bronze against the cloudless sky. And Esportia felt a complex, contradictory surge of emotions wash over her, relief and dread, longing and fear, the desperate desire to be safe within those walls warring with the knowledge of what she would face when she walked through the gates, the questions, the accusations, the cold, scrutinizing eyes of women who had already judged her and found her wanting. Fatima, sensing the princess's hesitation, pulled her horse alongside and spoke without looking at her, her eyes fixed on the palace ahead, telling Esportia that the hardest part of any battle was not the fighting itself, but the moment of stepping onto the field, that once the first step was taken, the rest would follow, and that she would not face this alone. The two women urged their horses forward, descending the hill in a slow, steady trot, and as they approached the gates, the sentries, who had been on high alert since Esportia's disappearance, spotted them and raised the alarm, the call echoing from tower to tower, gate to gate, until the entire palace was awake and aware that the prodigal princess was returning. Nilüfer Hatun was the first to appear in the courtyard, her face a mask of controlled fury and overwhelming relief, her eyes sweeping over Esportia with a gaze that catalogued every scratch, every bruise, every torn thread of her garments, assessing the damage with the clinical precision of a battlefield commander counting casualties. Behind her, Nilüfer and Iraz stood at a respectful distance, their expressions guarded, their thoughts unreadable. Suleiman and Qasim flanked the courtyard entrance, their hands on their swords, their posture radiating the tense, coiled readiness of warriors who had been deprived of their charge and were determined not to let it happen again. Fatima dismounted first, handing her reins to a waiting groom, and then moved to Esportia's horse, offering her hand to the princess as she dismounted on legs that trembled with exhaustion and apprehension. Esportia's feet touched the cobblestones of the courtyard, and for a moment the entire world seemed to hold its breath, every eye in the palace fixed upon this single, slender figure standing in the golden morning light, swaying slightly, her chin raised, her eyes red but dry, her bearing that of a woman who had passed through the fire and emerged, if not unscathed, then at least unbroken. Malhun stepped forward, and the air between them crackled with the tension of 100 unspoken words. And then, to the visible surprise of everyone present, the matriarch of the Kayı reached out and took Esportia's hands in her own, holding them tightly, firmly, and spoke in a voice that was low and fierce and trembling with the effort of containing the storm of emotions that raged within her. She told the princess that she was relieved, that she had been terrified, that she had spent the night imagining every possible horror that could befall a woman alone in the forest, and that this must never, ever happen again. There was no accusation in her words, no punishment, only the raw, unfiltered concern of a woman who had been entrusted with the safety of every soul within these walls, and who felt every failure of that trust as a wound upon her own heart. Esportia, overwhelmed by the unexpected gentleness, felt the last of her defenses crumble, and she stepped forward, pressing her forehead against Malhun's shoulder, not as a princess to a matriarch but as a lost child to a mother, and Malhun wrapped her arms around her, holding her tightly, silently, while the morning sun climbed higher and the shadows of the courtyard grew shorter and the world, for one brief, precious moment, stopped its relentless, grinding march toward the next crisis, and allowed itself the simple, healing luxury of an embrace. But the moment could not last, for the machinery of events, once set in motion, does not pause for human comfort, and the news that arrived with the messenger from the battlefield shattered the fragile peace of the morning like a stone thrown through glass. Damir Boga and Abdul Rahman rode through the gates at the head of a column of battle-weary soldiers, their armor dented and stained, their faces drawn with exhaustion, and the message they carried was a paradox wrapped in parchment, a declaration of victory laced with the poison of continuing danger. The battle at the valley had been won, they reported, the alliance of Damir Khan and Shahanshah broken, the Kechik turned to the Ottoman cause, but the enemy commanders had escaped. The traitor Yakid was still at large, and the Sultan himself had chosen to remain in the field, refusing to return to the palace until the threat was fully neutralized. Malhan received the news with the outward calm of a woman who had spent her entire life absorbing shocks that would have broken lesser souls. But those who knew her well could see the micro-expressions that flickered across her face like heat lightning on a summer horizon. The tightening of the jaw, the narrowing of the eyes, the almost imperceptible clenching of the hands that betrayed the titanic effort required to maintain her composure. She dismissed the assembled household with a wave of her hand, keeping only Fatima, Nilüfer, and Damir Boga in the chamber. And when the doors were closed and the servants had departed, she turned to Damir Boga and demanded the full, unvarnished truth, not the sanitized version intended for public consumption, but the raw, bloody reality of what had happened in the valley and what was likely to happen next. Damir Boga, a man whose courage on the battlefield was matched only by his unflinching honesty off it, laid out the situation with the blunt, unsparing clarity of a surgeon describing the severity of a wound. The victory, he explained, while decisive in military terms, had not been the clean, conclusive triumph that would allow them to breathe easily. Damir Khan had escaped with a force that, while small, was still capable of causing significant damage if it linked up with other disaffected elements along the frontier. Shahanshah, whose escape was the most troubling development of all, possessed not just military resources but a vast network of political connections, intelligence assets, and diplomatic leverage that made him far more dangerous than any conventional enemy. The man was a spider at the center of a web that stretched across multiple states and principalities, and cutting a few strands had done nothing to diminish his ability to spin new ones. And then there was Yakid, whose disappearance troubled Damir Boga on a level that went beyond strategic calculation and into the realm of instinct and intuition. A traitor who had been exposed but not captured was the most dangerous creature in the political bestiary, because he carried within him not just the knowledge of his former allies' strengths and weaknesses, but also the desperate, cornered fury of a man who knew that his only options were victory or death, and who was therefore capable of actions that a rational, self-preserving individual would never contemplate. Damir Boga told Malhan that Arhin had ordered the pursuit of all three, that Tarhin was already on Damir Khan's trail, that Faladios was working to secure the Kechik alliance, and that the Sultan himself was coordinating everything from a forward position that placed him within striking distance of any emerging threat. But he added, his voice dropping to a register of grave concern, the Sultan was exhausted, physically and emotionally, and the weight of the crown was pressing down upon him with a force that no amount of courage or determination could indefinitely withstand. He needed the assurance that his home was secure, that his family was safe, and that the internal divisions that had plagued the palace were being addressed, because a commander who was distracted by domestic turmoil was a commander who was vulnerable, and vulnerability, in this game of empires and assassins, was a luxury they simply could not afford. Malhan listened to every word, her face as still and as hard as carved marble, and when Damir Boga finished, she was silent for a long moment, the only sound in the chamber the soft, rhythmic ticking of the water clock on the shelf and the distant, muffled cry of the newborn from Ganka's chamber above. Then she turned to Nilüfer, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute, irrevocable authority. She told her daughter that the time for petty rivalries and personal grudges was over, that the survival of the House of Osman depended not on the swords of its men alone, but on the unity of its women, and that from this moment forward, every woman within these walls would stand together, shoulder to shoulder, face to face with the storm, or she would personally ensure that whoever broke the peace would face consequences that would make the battlefield look like a picnic. Nilüfer opened her mouth to respond, the familiar fire of defiance flickering in her eyes, but something in Malhun's gaze stopped her cold, a look that was not merely angry but ancient, primal, the look of a she-wolf defending her den with the full, terrifying force of maternal instinct. Nilüfer closed her mouth, swallowed, and nodded once, a sharp, reluctant acknowledgement that was as close to unconditional surrender as her proud spirit would ever allow. Fatima, standing quietly by the window, watched the exchange with a thoughtful, measuring expression, and when Malhun's gaze fell upon her, she straightened and spoke with quiet conviction, promising that she would serve as a bridge between the women of the palace, that she would use her position and her relationships to heal the rifts and build the trust that the household so desperately needed. Malhun regarded her for a long, searching moment, and then inclined her head in a gesture of approval that said more than words ever could. Far to the northeast, deep in the wilderness, Tarhin and his riders emerged from the dense forest into a narrow, rocky valley at the end of which stood the crumbling, moss-covered ruins of Kara Hisar, its broken towers rising from the earth like the skeletal fingers of a buried giant reaching toward the sky. The fortress had been abandoned for decades, its walls breached by time and weather, its interior reclaimed by creeping vines and nesting birds. But as Tarhin studied it through narrowed eyes, he could see the telltale signs of recent human activity, fresh footprints in the mud, the faint, barely visible wisp of smoke rising from somewhere deep within the ruins, and the almost imperceptible glint of metal, the reflection of sunlight off a sword or a piece of armor, flickering in one of the darkened windows. He signaled his riders to halt, dismounting silently and leading his horse into the cover of the tree line, and then settled into a position of watchful, patient observation, his body absolutely still, his breathing slow and controlled, his eyes tracking every movement, every shadow, every whisper of wind that disturbed the eerie, haunted silence of the abandoned fortress. He did not rush. He did not charge. He simply watched and waited and let the enemy reveal themselves, because Tarhin understood with the deep, instinctive wisdom of a born predator that the most effective weapon in his arsenal was not the sword at his side but the patience in his soul, and that the fortress before him, with all its hidden dangers and concealed secrets, would eventually yield its truth to the man who was willing to wait for it. Hours passed. The sun traced its slow, inexorable arc across the sky, and Tarhin watched. His riders, scattered through the tree line in positions that offered both concealment and clear lines of retreat, maintained their vigilance with the disciplined, silent endurance of men who had been trained to the very edge of human capability. And as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen and the air grew heavy with the warm, drowsy stillness of the late day, the fortress finally spoke. A door opened in the base of the eastern tower, a heavy, wooden door that scraped against the stone with a sound like the groan of a wounded animal, and a figure emerged, stepping cautiously into the fading light. It was a man Tarhin recognized instantly, a captain of Damir Khan's personal guard, a brutal, efficient killer whose reputation for cruelty was surpassed only by his reputation for loyalty to his master. The captain stood in the doorway for a long moment, his head swiveling slowly as he scanned the surrounding terrain with the practiced, methodical thoroughness of a professional soldier checking for threats. And then, apparently satisfied that the approach was clear, he turned and signaled to someone inside the tower. A second figure appeared, then a third, then a fourth, a steady stream of armed men filing out of the fortress and assembling in the courtyard, their movements hurried and furtive, the unmistakable body language of men preparing for a rapid departure. Tarhin counted them carefully, his lips moving silently as the numbers climbed, 14, 22, 31, 45, and then finally, emerging from the darkness of the doorway like a spider from its web, Damir Khan himself, his armor battered, his face haggard, his eyes burning with the incandescent, self-consuming fury of a man whose world had collapsed around him, and who blamed everyone but himself for the catastrophe. But Damir Khan was not alone. Walking beside him, his head bowed, his gait shuffling and defeated, was a figure that made Tarhin's blood run cold and his hand tighten on the hilt of his sword with a grip that could have crushed stone. It was Yakid. The traitor had not vanished into the wilderness at all. He had run straight to the man whose cause he had championed, the man whose promises of power and position had lured him away from the path of honor and into the mire of betrayal. And now the two of them stood together in the crumbling courtyard of the abandoned fortress, two architects of treachery united in their desperation, their combined presence a concentration of malice and danger that could not be allowed to persist. Tarhin's first instinct was to attack immediately, to lead his riders in a screaming charge that would cut through the enemy like a scythe through wheat, and end the threat with a single, decisive stroke. But his training, his discipline, and the quiet, insistent voice of strategic reason held him in check. He was outnumbered more than 2-1, and while his riders were vastly superior to Damir Khan's demoralized survivors in terms of skill and morale, the fortress, even in its ruined state, offered defensive advantages that could negate his tactical superiority and turn a swift victory into a bloody, protracted siege. No. The correct course of action was to maintain surveillance, to follow the enemy when they moved, to report their position and their numbers back to the Sultan, and to wait for reinforcements that would allow the strike to be delivered with overwhelming, irresistible force. Tarhin dispatched his fastest rider back toward the main camp with a detailed report, and then settled back into his concealment, his eyes fixed on the fortress, his patience inexhaustible, his resolve as unyielding as the mountain stone upon which he sat. As the evening shadows crept across the valley like the advancing edge of a great, dark tide, Damir Khan convened a war council of his own within the ruined walls of Kara Hissar, a desperate, ragged gathering of bruised and battered men who had tasted defeat and were struggling to swallow its bitter, acrid flavor. The firelight danced across their faces, illuminating the cuts, the bruises, the haunted, hollow eyes of soldiers who had gone into battle expecting victory and emerged into a world in which everything they had believed, every promise they had been given, every assurance of triumph and glory, had been revealed as lies, as smoke, as the empty, echoing words of men who valued their own survival above the lives of those who served them. Damir Khan paced before the fire, his shadow stretching and contracting on the crumbling stone wall behind him, and his voice, when he spoke, was raw and ragged, stripped of the arrogant confidence that had once been his most potent weapon and his most defining characteristic. He told his men that they had been betrayed not by the enemy but by their own allies, that the Kechik, whom they had trusted, whom they had armed and paid and treated as brothers, had turned their swords against them at the moment of greatest need, revealing themselves to be the treacherous, duplicitous, faithless curs that their enemies had always claimed they were. He conveniently omitted, of course, the fact that it was his own conspiracy with Shahanshah to betray the Kechik after the battle that had driven them into Arhin's camp. But truth, in the mouth of a desperate man, is a malleable, obedient servant that can be bent and twisted into whatever shape best serves its master's need. He spoke of vengeance, of rebuilding, of seeking new allies among the disaffected warlords and bandits who roamed the borderlands, and he painted a picture of future triumph that was vivid enough to kindle a spark of hope in the eyes of his weary, disillusioned followers, a spark that was, for the moment, all he needed to keep them in line and prevent the complete collapse of his authority. Yakid sat apart from the others, his back pressed against the cold stone wall, his knees drawn up to his chest, his eyes staring into the fire with the empty, unfocused gaze of a man who had retreated into the deepest, most unreachable chambers of his own mind. The blood of the young Kayı soldier still stained his hands, dried now to a dark, flacking crust that he could not seem to stop staring at, could not seem to stop feeling, as if the dead boy's life force had seeped through his skin and lodged itself in his bones, a permanent, irremovable reminder of the price of his betrayal. He had come to Damir Khan not out of loyalty or conviction, but out of sheer, animal terror, the blind, panicked flight of a creature that had been exposed and had nowhere else to go. The Kayı would kill him on sight. The villages would turn him in for the bounty that would certainly be placed on his head. The wilderness would consume him within days. Damir Khan, for all his faults, at least offered the illusion of protection, the thin, transparent shield of numbers and organization that stood between Yakid and the howling void of his own guilt. But even as he sat in the flickering warmth of the fire, surrounded by men who called themselves his comrades, Yakid felt the cold, creeping fingers of despair wrapping around his heart, squeezing tighter with every passing moment. And he knew, with a certainty that was as absolute and as inescapable as the turning of the earth, that there was no refuge for a man who had betrayed his brothers, no fortress thick enough, no army strong enough, no lie convincing enough to shield him from the justice that was coming. Slowly, inevitably, inexorably, like the tide, like the dawn, like the hand of the Almighty Himself reaching down through the clouds to close around the throat of the guilty and drag him to account. And as the night deepened and the stars emerged one by one, cold and distant and indifferent to the suffering of the mortals below, the world held its breath, poised on the knife edge between what had happened and what was yet to come. In the palace, Ganka slept with her newborn child cradled against her breast. Malhun stood watch by the window, her eyes scanning the dark horizon for the dust cloud that would signal the return of the Sultan, and Esportia lay awake in her chamber, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the vision in the forest over and over, the image of Arhin's hand reaching toward her, the sound of his voice telling her she was strong, the aching, hollow feeling of his sudden disappearance. And she whispered his name into the darkness, not as a prayer but as a promise, a vow made to herself and to the night and to whatever force had placed her upon this path, that she would not run again, that she would stand, that she would face whatever came with the strength that Arhin had seen in her even when she could not see it in herself. In the forest, Tarhin watched the fortress with the unblinking, infinite patience of a hawk circling above a field of mice, his mind calculating, his instincts alert, his sword ready. In the forward camp, Arhin Sahib sat alone in his tent, a single candle guttering on the table before him, casting long, dancing shadows across the maps and dispatches that were spread before him like the pages of a half-written story, and he studied them with the focused, relentless intensity of a man who understood that the war was not a single event but a continuous, evolving, living thing, a beast with 1,000 heads that grew 2 more for every one that was severed, and that the only way to slay it was not with brute force alone, but with cunning, with patience, with the strategic vision to see 3 moves ahead while the enemy was still contemplating 1. He traced his finger along the map, following the line of the frontier from the valley to the ruins of Kara Hissar, from there to the borderlands, from the borderlands to the distant, gleaming capital of Constantinople, and he saw, spread before him like a tapestry yet to be woven, the vast, terrifying, magnificent scope of the task that lay ahead, a task that would demand everything he had and everything he was and everything he might yet become, and he whispered a prayer, not for victory, not for glory, but for the strength to endure, to persist, to keep walking the path that had been laid before him, even when the darkness was absolute and the road ahead was invisible, and the only light was the tiny, flickering flame of faith that burned within his chest, a flame that he shielded with cupped hands against the howling wind of uncertainty, feeding it with the fuel of memory and honor and love, knowing that if that flame ever went out, all would be lost, but that as long as it burned, as long as it cast even the faintest glow against the encircling darkness, there was hope, there was purpose, there was reason to draw the sword one more time and step forward into the unknown. The wind blew through the valley, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and blood, and the faint, haunting fragrance of the wildflowers that grew along the riverbank, flowers that had been crushed beneath the hooves of charging horses and the boots of fighting men, but that were already beginning to lift their battered heads back toward the sun, their roots deeper than the violence that had tried to destroy them, their colors brighter for having been tested, their petals reaching upward with the same quiet, stubborn, indomitable defiance that lived in the hearts of the men and women who fought and loved and grieved, and endured beneath the banner of the House of Osman. And the story, that great, rolling, thundering river of blood and faith and fire, continued to flow, carrying all of them forward, friend and foe, hero and traitor, mother and warrior, into the vast, uncharted ocean of the future, where new battles waited, new betrayals festered, new alliances formed, new children were born, new prayers were whispered, and the ancient, eternal struggle between light and darkness, between justice and tyranny, between the sword and the soul, played out its next, inevitable, magnificent chapter in the endless, unfinished epic of history itself. The morning that followed was not a morning of peace, but a morning of reckoning, a morning in which the sun rose not as a benediction, but as a searchlight, illuminating with merciless, golden clarity the full scope of the devastation that had been wrought upon the land and upon the souls of those who walked it. The battlefield in the valley had been cleared, the dead buried in long, solemn rows beneath the earth they had fought to defend or to conquer, their graves marked with simple stones that bore no names, only the silent, universal testimony of men who had lived and died in the service of something larger than themselves. And the wounded had been transported to the makeshift field hospital that Tamir Boga had established in a sheltered ravine behind the main camp, where the healers worked with tireless, grim-faced dedication, their hands stained with blood and poultice, their voices murmuring the ancient prayers of healing that had been passed down through generations of frontier physicians. Arhin Sahib walked among the wounded at first light, moving from pallet to pallet, kneeling beside each man, looking into each pair of pain-clouded eyes, and speaking words of comfort and gratitude that came not from the formal, rehearsed vocabulary of a sovereign performing his duty, but from the deep, authentic well of a man who genuinely understood the cost of what he had asked these men to give, and who felt the weight of every wound as if it had been inflicted upon his own body. A young soldier, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, lay on a bloodied mat, his legs shattered below the knee, his face gray with shock and loss. And when Arhin knelt beside him, the boy reached out with a trembling hand and grasped the Sultan's wrist, whispering that he was sorry, that he had tried to hold his position, that the enemy had come from 3 sides at once and he had been overwhelmed, that he had failed. Arhin took the boy's hand in both of his own, holding it with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible from hands that had wielded a sword through hours of relentless combat, and told him that he had not failed, that no man who stood his ground in the face of overwhelming odds and shed his blood for the cause of justice had ever failed, that failure belonged only to those who refused to stand at all, and that this wound, this sacrifice, would be honored and remembered long after the names of the cowards who had inflicted it were forgotten by history and by God. The boy's eyes filled with tears, not of pain, but of something deeper and more sustaining, a fierce, burning gratitude that cut through the fog of his suffering like a blade of light, and he whispered a prayer for his sultan, a simple, halting benediction that Arhin received with bowed head and closed eyes, as if it were the most precious gift he had ever been given. From the field hospital, Arhin proceeded to the forward command post, a rough, hastily constructed shelter of logs and canvas that served as the nerve center of the ongoing operation. The maps were spread across the central table, weighted down with stones and spent arrowheads, and around them stood the remaining commanders, Shamil, Kuladz, Kilil, and Abdul Rahman, who had returned from escorting the palace contingent and ridden through the night to rejoin his sultan, arriving just before dawn with his horse lathered and his eyes red with exhaustion, but his spirit undimmed and his sword sharp. The intelligence reports that had trickled in overnight painted a picture that was simultaneously encouraging and deeply troubling. Tarhin's dispatch, carried by his fastest rider, had reached the camp in the small hours, confirming that Damir Khan had taken refuge in the ruins of Kara Hisar with approximately 45 fighters, and critically, that Yakid was with him. The news that the traitor had allied himself openly with the enemy sent a ripple of cold, controlled fury through the assembled commanders, each man processing the information through the lens of his own experience and his own particular brand of martial philosophy. Abdul Rahman, whose approach to problems tended toward the direct and the devastating, advocated an immediate full-scale assault on the fortress, arguing that they had the numbers, the momentum, and the moral imperative to strike while the enemy was still disorganized and demoralized, that every hour of delay gave Damir Khan time to send messengers, recruit reinforcements, and fortify his position. Shamil, more cautious by nature, counseled patience, suggesting that a siege would be less costly in terms of lives and would achieve the same result with greater certainty, starving the defenders out or forcing them into a desperate sortie that could be crushed by superior numbers in the open field. Kulads and Kilil, as always, deferred to their sultan's judgment, their loyalty expressed not through the articulation of strategy, but through the silent, unwavering readiness to execute whatever plan was adopted with the full force of their considerable martial abilities. Arhin listened to each argument, his face betraying nothing, his mind working through the layers of the problem with the methodical, relentless thoroughness that had become the hallmark of his command style. He understood Abdul Rahman's impatience, the burning desire to end the threat quickly and decisively, but he also understood the danger of haste, the way it could transform a controlled operation into a chaotic melee in which the advantages of superior planning and coordination were negated by the fog of close-quarters combat. He understood Shamil's caution, the wisdom of patience, but he also knew that time was not an unlimited resource, that every day Damir Khan remained free was a day in which Shahanshah could use his networks to cause mischief elsewhere, destabilizing the fragile political landscape that the Ottomans were trying to build. And beneath all the strategic calculus, beneath the maps and the troop dispositions and the supply calculations, there was the personal dimension, the knowledge that Yakid was in that fortress, the man who had betrayed his brothers, who had sold his honor for promises of power, who had stood by while Boran was murdered and had felt nothing, nothing but the hollow, self-serving satisfaction of a man who had chosen the winning side, except that the winning side had turned out to be the losing side. And now Yakid was trapped in a crumbling ruin with a defeated commander and a handful of frightened, disillusioned soldiers, and the justice that had been denied for so long was finally, tantalizingly, within reach. Arhin made his decision. He would not assault the fortress, and he would not siege it. He would do something that none of his commanders had anticipated, something that required a different kind of courage than the physical bravery of the battlefield. The courage to face his enemy not with a sword but with words, not from behind a shield wall but standing alone, exposed, vulnerable, relying on nothing but the force of his presence and the righteousness of his cause. He announced to his stunned commanders that he would ride to Kara Hisar himself, that he would approach the fortress under a flag of parley, and that he would offer Damir Khan a choice: surrender and face a fair trial under Ottoman law, or resist and be destroyed, not today, not tomorrow, but inevitably, inexorably, as certainly as the sun would rise and the rivers would flow and the mountains would crumble to dust. The commanders erupted in protest, Abdul Rahman slamming his massive fist on the table and declaring that the Sultan was the heart of the army and could not be risked in such a reckless gambit, Shamil arguing that Damir Khan was a treacherous snake who would use the parley as an opportunity for assassination, Kulads and Kilil exchanging grim, knowing glances that communicated their silent agreement that their Sultan had lost his mind. But Arhin silenced them all with a single raised hand, his eyes sweeping the room with a gaze that was calm, steady, and absolutely, utterly immovable. He told them that he was not asking for permission, that the decision was made, that a sultan who hid behind his soldiers while sending them to die was not a sultan but a coward, and that the men of the Kayı had bled enough, sacrificed enough, given enough, and that if there was a chance, even the slimmest, most improbable chance that further bloodshed could be avoided, he was obligated by his oath, by his faith, and by the legacy of his father to pursue it. He would ride to Kara Hisar at dawn the following day, and he would take with him only Tarhin, because some battles required an army and some required only 2 men and the truth. The news of the Sultan's decision spread through the camp like wildfire, igniting a blaze of conflicting emotions that burned through the ranks with the intensity of a forest fire, some men expressing fierce, admiring support for their Sultan's courage, others muttering dark, worried prayers for his safety, and a few, the cynics, the battle-hardened veterans who had seen too many good men die in the pursuit of noble gestures, shaking their heads and preparing themselves for the worst. Abdul Rahman, unable to reconcile his warrior's instinct with his sultan's command, sought out Jarkata Sahib, who had been overseeing the fortification of the valley's defenses with the grim, mechanical efficiency of a man who was keeping himself busy to avoid drowning in his own grief. When Abdul Rahman told him of Arhin's plan, Jarkata's reaction was not what he expected. The grieving warrior was silent for a long, heavy moment, his scarred hands still, his eyes fixed on some distant, invisible point, and then he spoke, his voice low and rough, like gravel sliding over stone. He said that Arhin was right, that a true leader does not ask his men to face risks that he himself is unwilling to confront, and that if the Sultan believed that the path to justice lay through the gates of Kara Hisar rather than over its walls, then Jarkata would trust his judgment, as he had always trusted it, as Boran would have trusted it, as their father Osman Sahib would have trusted it. But he added, his voice dropping to a growl that was more threat than statement, that if a single hair on the Sultan's head was harmed during this parley, he would personally lead the assault that would reduce Kara Hisar to rubble and every living soul within it to dust, and that no force on earth, human or divine, would be sufficient to stay his hand. Abdul Rahman looked at Jarkata, seeing in the older warrior's eyes not just grief and rage, but something that transcended both, a faith so deep and so absolute that it had become indistinguishable from the bedrock upon which the man's entire identity was built. And he nodded slowly, accepting the wisdom of the decision, even as every fiber of his warrior's soul screamed in protest. The night before the parley was long and sleepless, the camp humming with a low, nervous energy that pulsed through the tents and the watchfires like an electric current. Arhin spent the evening in his tent, not poring over maps or sharpening his sword, but sitting in silence, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and deep, the rhythmic, meditative breathing of a man who was gathering himself, consolidating his strength, drawing from the deepest reserves of his spirit the calm, centered clarity that he would need to face the most dangerous moment of his reign. He thought of his father, the great Osman Sahib, whose shadow stretched across the land like the shadow of a mountain, vast, permanent, and impossible to escape. He thought of the lessons his father had taught him, not just the lessons of the sword and the strategy table, but the deeper, harder lessons, the lessons of mercy and restraint, of knowing when to strike and when to stay the hand, of understanding that true strength was not the ability to destroy one's enemies, but the wisdom to offer them a chance for redemption, and the resolve to enforce justice when that chance was refused. He thought of Boran, whose laughter he would never hear again, whose counsel he would never seek again, whose steady, reassuring presence at his side had been a constant throughout the most turbulent years of his life, and he felt the grief rising in his chest like a dark tide, threatening to overwhelm the fragile dam of his composure, but he breathed through it, letting the wave wash over him and recede, leaving behind not weakness but a deeper, more tempered strength. the strength of a man who had looked into the abyss of loss and chosen not to fall, but to build a bridge across it. He thought of Esportia, of her torn garments and her haunted eyes, and the small, brave flame that he had seen flickering in the depths of her soul. A flame that he recognized because it burned within his own chest, the flame of a person who refuses to be defined by their circumstances and insists, against all evidence and all reason, on forging their own destiny. And he thought of the child he did not yet know had been born, the newest member of the House of Osman, arriving in the world in the midst of blood and fire and fear, a tiny, fragile vessel of hope launched upon a stormy sea. And he prayed, with a fervor that brought tears to his closed eyes, that the storms would pass, and the seas would calm, and the child would grow up in a world where justice was not a distant, unattainable ideal but a living, breathing reality. The foundation upon which a great and enduring civilization would be built. Dawn arrived with a cold, gray light that seeped through the canvas of the tent like water through a cracked wall, and Arhin Sahib rose, dressed, and stepped out into the morning air with the quiet, deliberate composure of a man walking toward his destiny. Tarhin was already waiting, his horse saddled and ready, his armor polished to a dull, functional gleam, his face set in the expression of absolute, focused readiness that Arhin had come to know as well as his own reflection. The two men mounted without a word, the silence between them not empty but full, charged with the unspoken bond of two warriors who had faced death together so many times that words had become superfluous, their understanding of each other as deep and as instinctive as the understanding between a hawk and the wind. They rode out of the camp at a walk, passing through the lines of soldiers who had gathered along the route to watch their sultan depart, and the men did not cheer or shout or wave their swords, but stood in silence, their hands on their hearts, their eyes following the two riders with a mixture of pride and fear and love so intense it seemed to crackle in the air like the charge before a lightning strike. Jarkata stood at the edge of the camp, his arms folded across his bandaged chest, his eyes locked on the departing figure of his sultan, and as Arhin passed, the two men exchanged a single, brief glance that communicated everything: the trust, the love, the shared grief, the unspoken promise that this was not goodbye but merely a pause, a breath between the lines of a story that was still being written. The ride to Kara Hisar took the better part of the morning, the two riders following the trail that Tarhin's scouts had marked, winding through dense forest and across open meadows, and along the banks of swift, cold streams that cut through the landscape like silver ribbons. They spoke rarely, and when they did, it was in the clipped, economical shorthand of men conserving their energy for the confrontation ahead. Tarhin briefed his sultan on the layout of the fortress, describing the breaches in the walls, the position of the sentries, the likely locations of Damir Khan's command post and Yakid's quarters, and the escape routes that the enemy would most likely use if the parley went wrong, and a fight became unavoidable. Arhin absorbed the information with his characteristic, methodical thoroughness, filing each detail away in the vast, organized archive of his tactical mind. But his thoughts kept returning to the central question that would determine the outcome of the encounter, not the question of how to fight, but the question of what to say, how to reach through the armor of pride and fear and desperation that encased Damir Khan's soul and touch whatever remnant of reason and humanity still existed within the man. He knew that the odds of success were slim, that Damir Khan's arrogance was a fortress more impregnable than any structure of stone and mortar. But he also knew that he had to try, that the attempt itself was a statement, a declaration of the kind of ruler he intended to be, a ruler who offered mercy before justice, and who exhausted every avenue of peace before unleashing the terrible, irreversible dogs of war. They arrived at the edge of the valley that cradled the ruins of Kara Hisar in the early afternoon, the sun high and hot, casting sharp, angular shadows across the broken walls and crumbling towers. Tarhin raised the white flag of parley, a simple cloth attached to a spear shaft, and they rode forward slowly, their horses' hooves echoing off the stone walls with a hollow, reverberating sound that seemed to announce their presence to the very stones of the fortress. They were spotted almost immediately, and within minutes, a cluster of armed men appeared on the battlements, their bows drawn, their faces masks of suspicion and hostility. Tarhin called out in a clear, carrying voice, announcing that Sultan Arhin Sahib of the House of Osman sought a parley with Damir Khan under the ancient laws of truce, and that any violation of those laws would bring down upon the violator the wrath of God and the fury of the mightiest army in Anatolia. There was a long, tense silence, during which the archers on the walls shifted nervously, their arrows tracking the two riders with the twitchy, uncertain movements of men who were torn between obedience and instinct. And then the heavy wooden gate creaked open, just wide enough to admit a single rider, and a voice from within, harsh and suspicious, called out that Damir Khan would hear the Sultan's words, but that if this was a trick, the Ottoman dogs would be the first to die. Arhin dismounted and walked through the gate alone, Tarhin remaining outside with the horses, positioned at the precise spot from which he could both observe the gate and, if necessary, charge through it with maximum speed and force. The courtyard of Kara Hissar was a desolate, rubble-strewn expanse, the remnants of what had once been a grand military installation now reduced to broken columns, collapsed roofs, and the creeping, relentless encroachment of nature reclaiming what had been stolen from it. Damir Khan stood in the center of the courtyard, flanked by his remaining captains, his sword at his hip, his posture rigid with the defensive, bristling hostility of a man who expected an attack from every direction. Behind him, lurking in the shadows of a collapsed archway, Yakid stood with his back pressed against the wall, his eyes wide and darting, his hand on his sword hilt, his entire body vibrating with the barely contained tremors of a man whose nerves had been stretched to the absolute breaking point. Arhin walked toward them with measured, unhurried steps, his hands empty, his gaze fixed on Damir Khan's eyes, and when he stopped, close enough to speak without raising his voice, the silence that fell between them was so profound, so heavy, so charged with the accumulated weight of everything that had passed between these two men and everything that was yet to come, that it seemed to have a physical presence, a mass and a density that pressed against the chest and made breathing difficult. Arhin spoke first. He did not shout, did not threaten, did not posture or preen or indulge in the rhetorical flourishes that were the stock and trade of commanders addressing their enemies. He simply spoke, in a voice that was quiet, clear, and devastating in its simplicity, telling Damir Khan that the war was over, that his army was destroyed, his allies had betrayed him, his fortress was surrounded, and that the only choice that remained was the manner in which he would face the consequences of his actions. He could surrender, Arhin told him, and stand trial before a council of just men, where the evidence would be weighed, the testimony heard, and the verdict rendered according to the law and the will of the Almighty. If he was found guilty, the punishment would be severe, but it would be just, and his men, those who had followed him out of loyalty rather than malice, would be given the opportunity to lay down their arms and return to their homes with their lives and their honor intact. Or, Arhin continued, his voice dropping to a register that was barely above a whisper, but that somehow carried to every ear in the courtyard. He could resist, and condemn himself and every man under his command to a death that would be violent, prolonged, and utterly without meaning. A death that would accomplish nothing, change nothing, save nothing, and leave nothing behind but blood-stained rubble and the fatting memory of a fool who chose pride over survival. Arhin paused, letting the words settle into the silence, and then added in a tone that carried not triumph but genuine, weary sadness, that he had not come to gloat or to humiliate, that he took no pleasure in the suffering of his enemies, that the blood that had been shed on both sides was a tragedy that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life, and that if there was any way, any possible way, to end this cycle of violence without spilling one more drop of blood, he was prepared to take it. Because a sultan who rejoiced in slaughter was not a sultan but a butcher, and the house of Osman had been built by shepherds, by men who understood that the true measure of strength was not the ability to destroy, but the willingness to protect. Damir Khan listened to every word, his face undergoing a slow, visible transformation as the Sultan spoke, the rigid mask of defiance softening, cracking, revealing beneath it the exhausted, frightened, confused face of a man who had gambled everything on a single throw of the dice and lost. His eyes flickered to his captains, seeing in their faces the same doubt, the same weariness, the same desperate desire for this nightmare to end that he himself was struggling to suppress. He looked at Yakid, who was pressed so far into the shadows that he was barely visible, his face a ghastly, colorless mask of terror. And Damir Khan felt a sudden, hot surge of contempt for the traitor who had attached himself to his cause like a parasite, bringing nothing of value and consuming everything he touched. And then Damir Khan looked back at Arhin, at the Sultan who stood before him unarmed, unguarded, vulnerable, offering mercy to a man who had tried to kill him. And he saw something in those eyes that he had never seen before, not weakness, not naivety, not the soft, bleeding compassion of a man too gentle for the brutal realities of power, but something far more terrifying, a strength so absolute, so deeply rooted, so fundamentally unshakable that it made the swords and the walls and the armies seem like children's toys by comparison. The strength of a man who knew exactly who he was and exactly what he stood for, and who was prepared to die for it without a moment's hesitation. And in that moment, standing in the ruins of his ambition, surrounded by the wreckage of his pride, Damir Khan felt something he had never expected to feel, something that cut through the armor of his arrogance like a blade through silk, something that was as old as the mountains and as deep as the sea and as impossible to resist as the turning of the earth upon its axis. He felt respect. The silence stretched on, each second an eternity, the air heavy with the dust of centuries and the weight of a decision that would determine the fate of nations. Damir Khan's hand moved to the hilt of his sword, and every soldier in the courtyard tensed, hands tightening on weapons, breaths catching in throats. The entire tableau balanced on a razor's edge between peace and annihilation. And then, slowly, deliberately, with the painful, grinding reluctance of a man whose pride was being peeled away from his soul like skin from a wound, Damir Khan drew his sword, held it before him for one long, trembling moment, and then reversed it, extending the hilt toward Arhin in the ancient, unmistakable gesture of surrender. His captains, one by one, followed suit, the clatter of swords being laid upon the ground filling the courtyard like the sound of a chain being broken, link by link, the bonds of war giving way to the fragile, tentative, miraculous possibility of peace. But Yakid did not surrender. The traitor, seeing the collapse of his last refuge, the evaporation of his final shield, snapped. With a wild, inhuman scream that echoed off the ruined walls like the cry of a damned soul, he drew his sword and lunged toward Arhin, his blade aimed at the Sultan's exposed back, his eyes blazing with the insane, self-destructive fury of a man who had decided that if he could not survive, he would at least drag his enemy into the abyss with him. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, every detail crystallizing with the hyper-vivid clarity of a moment that would be remembered forever. The flash of the blade, the scream, the dust motes hanging motionless in the golden afternoon light, the expression on Arhin's face as he turned, not surprise, not fear, but a deep, sorrowful resignation, the look of a man who had offered mercy and been answered with madness. And then Tarhin was there. He materialized in the gateway like a thunderbolt made flesh, having cleared the distance between the gate and the courtyard in a burst of speed that defied the limitations of human physiology, his sword already drawn, already moving in the devastating, unstoppable arc that had ended the lives of 100 men before this one. The blade intercepted Yakid's strike with a clash that sent sparks showering through the air like fallen stars, deflecting the traitor's sword away from the Sultan's body and sending Yakid staggering backward, off balance, exposed. Tarhin did not give him time to recover. He pressed forward with the relentless, machine-like precision that had made him the most feared swordsman on the frontier, his blade a blur of silver that drove Yakid backward across the courtyard, step by desperate step, the traitor's parries growing weaker, sloppier, more frantic with each exchange, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps, his eyes wide with the dawning, horrifying realization that he was hopelessly, irredeemably outmatched. And yet Tarhin did not deliver the killing blow. He drove Yakid to his knees, knocked the sword from his trembling hands, and then stepped back, his blade resting against the traitor's throat, the steel cold and sharp against the pulsing, vulnerable flesh, and he looked at his sultan, waiting, his eyes asking the question that his lips did not need to form. Arhin Sahib looked at the kneeling figure of Yakid, at the man who had once been his brother in arms, who had shared his bread and his fire and his faith, who had sworn oaths of loyalty beneath the same stars that now looked down upon his disgrace. And he felt not the satisfaction of vengeance, but the hollow, aching sorrow of a wound that would never fully heal. He stepped forward, his shadow falling across the traitor like the shadow of judgment itself, and he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, telling Yakid that he had been given every chance, every opportunity to choose the right path, that the door of repentance had been left open for him at every turning, and that he, Yakid, had slammed it shut with his own hands, again and again, until there was no door left, only a wall. A wall built from the bricks of his own treachery, and mortared with the blood of the innocent. Arhin told him that he would not be killed here, in this courtyard, in this ruin, because his death was not a private matter between two men, but a public reckoning that belonged to the people he had betrayed, to the families of the soldiers who had died because of his treachery, to the nation whose trust he had violated, and that he would be taken back to the capital, where he would stand before a court of justice and answer for his crimes in the full, unblinking light of day. Yakid kneeling in the dust, his hands empty, his face streaked with tears and dirt and the unmistakable, indelible stain of absolute, total defeat, looked up at the Sultan who had once called him brother, and whispered in a voice so broken, so hollow, so devoid of everything that had once made it human, that he was sorry that he had been wrong, that the promises of Shahanshah had blinded him to everything that mattered, and that if he could go back, if he could undo what he had done, he would give everything, his life, his soul, his very existence to make it right. Arhin looked at him for a long, measureless moment, and then turned away, his cloak sweeping the dust of the courtyard as he walked toward the gate, his voice carrying back over his shoulder with the weight of a tombstone being placed upon a grave, telling Tarhin to bind the prisoner, to treat him with the dignity owed to any human being, and to bring him to the capital for trial. And as Tarhin moved to obey, securing Yakid's wrists with rope and lifting him to his feet with a grip that was firm but not cruel, the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold and deep, bruised purple, and the ruins of Kara Hissar, which had served as the last refuge of treachery and the final stage of a confrontation that had been months in the making, slowly, imperceptibly, began to recede into the darkness, its broken towers dissolving into the gathering dusk like the fading memory of a nightmare from which the sleeper was finally, mercifully, beginning to awake. But the awakening was not complete, and the nightmare was not over, because somewhere out there, beyond the mountains, beyond the forests, beyond the reach of Arhin's swords and Tarhin's vigilance, Shahanshah still lurked, his web still intact, his venom still potent, his mind already spinning new schemes and weaving new plots from the shadows of his exile. The spider had lost a battle, but the web was vast, stretching across continents and through the corridors of power in a dozen courts and capitals, and the strands that had been cut were already being repaired, new connections being forged, new alliances being tested, new weapons being sharpened for the next confrontation, a confrontation that Shahanshah knew with the patient, calculating certainty of a man who had been playing this game for decades, was not a matter of if but when, and Arhin knew it too. He knew it as he rode back through the darkening forest toward his camp, Tarhin at his side, and the prisoner stumbling behind them under guard. He knew it as he dictated his dispatch to the palace, informing Malhun of the capture of Damir Khan and Yakid, and the successful conclusion of the immediate military operation. He knew it as he stood alone at the edge of the camp, looking up at the stars that were beginning to emerge from the velvet darkness of the sky, each one a tiny, distant flame burning in the infinite void. And he understood, with the deep, bone-level comprehension of a man who had been forged in the fires of war and tempered in the waters of grief, that the story he was living was not a story with a neat, satisfying ending, not a tale that could be wrapped up with a single decisive battle or a single dramatic confrontation, but an ongoing, evolving, endlessly complex narrative that would continue to unfold long after his own part in it was over. A story that belonged not to any one man, but to the land, to the people, to the faith, to the eternal, unquenchable flame of human aspiration that burned at the heart of every soul that had ever looked up at the stars and dared to dream of a world more just, more beautiful, and more worthy of the divine spark that animated its creation. And in the palace, as the dispatch arrived and was read aloud in the private chamber where Malhun, Nilüfer, Fatima, and Esportia had gathered, a complex, multifaceted silence descended upon the room, a silence composed of relief, gratitude, exhaustion, and the lingering, inescapable awareness that the peace they had been granted was not a destination but a waypoint, a brief, precious respite on a journey that had no visible end. Malhun pressed the dispatch to her heart, her lips moving in a whispered prayer of thanks, her eyes shining with tears that she would never allow to fall in public, but that, in this moment, in this small, sacred circle of women who had held the household together through the darkest of nights, she permitted herself to shed. Nilüfer bowed her head, her usual sharpness softened by the magnitude of the news, her hand finding and squeezing Esportia's hand in a gesture that was as close to an apology as her proud, unbending nature would ever allow. Esportia, feeling the pressure of Nilüfer's fingers, looked at her in surprise, seeing in the older woman's eyes not the hostility she had come to expect but something else, something fragile and tentative and unexpected, a flicker of recognition, of shared experience, of the grudging, difficult, transformative understanding that they were all, every one of them, fighting the same war on different fronts, and that the only way to win it was together. And Fatima, standing by the window, looked out at the darkening sky, her face illuminated by the last, dying rays of the sunset, and she thought of the Sultan riding through the forest, of Tarhan's unwavering vigilance, of Jarkada's consuming grief, of the newborn child sleeping peacefully in Ganka's arms, unaware of the blood that had been shed and the sacrifices that had been made to ensure its survival, and she whispered into the evening air a prayer that was as old as the hills and as new as the morning. A prayer for strength, for unity, for the courage to face whatever the dawn would bring, knowing that the dawn would bring both light and shadow, both hope and danger, both the promise of a new beginning and the certainty that the struggle, the great, eternal, magnificent, terrible struggle between what the world is and what it could be, would continue, relentlessly, beautifully, heartbreakingly, until the last chapter was written and the final word was spoken and the story at last was complete. But that day was not today. Today there was only the night and the stars and the quiet, stubborn, unextinguishable flame of faith burning in the hearts of those who refused to let the darkness win, who stood at the edge of history and whispered into the void, with voices that trembled but did not break, that the morning would come, that the sword would find its mark, that justice would prevail, that the story was not over, not yet, not yet, not yet.
The trials began on the 7th day after the Sultan's return to the capital, convened in the great hall of the palace, whose vaulted ceilings soared upward like the ribcage of some colossal ancient beast, the stone columns that supported them carved with intricate geometric patterns that seemed to shift and breathe in the flickering light of the hundreds of oil lamps that had been suspended from iron chains at intervals along the walls, casting a warm, golden illumination that did nothing to soften the cold, unyielding atmosphere of judgment that permeated every corner of the chamber like the scent of iron and old stone. The hall had been arranged according to the ancient protocols of Ottoman justice, the Sultan's throne elevated upon a raised dais at the far end, flanked by the seats of the senior commanders and the religious scholars who would serve as advisors and witnesses to the proceedings, their presence a guarantee that the verdicts rendered would be grounded not merely in the Sultan's personal authority, but in the deeper, more enduring authority of divine law and the collective wisdom of the learned. The public galleries were packed to capacity, the citizens of the capital having queued since before dawn for the privilege of witnessing the reckoning that had been the sole topic of conversation in every marketplace, every coffee house, every workshop, and every household since the army's triumphant return, and the air buzzed with the low electric hum of 1,000 whispered conversations, speculation and rumor and righteous indignation swirling together into a volatile, combustible atmosphere that could, at any moment, ignite into something raw and uncontrollable. Arhin Sahib had anticipated this, had prepared for it with the same meticulous strategic thoroughness that he brought to every aspect of his governance, and he had stationed guards at every entrance and exit, their presence visible but not threatening, a subtle reminder that while the proceedings were public and transparent, they were also orderly and controlled, subject to the discipline and the decorum that the solemnity of the occasion demanded. Damir Khan was brought in first, escorted by 4 guards who walked with the measured, ceremonial precision of soldiers performing a duty that they understood to be not merely military but sacred, a ritual enactment of the principle that no man, however powerful, however wealthy, however connected, was above the law. Damir Khan walked with his back straight and his head held high, his eyes sweeping the hall with a gaze that was defiant but also beneath the bravado haunted, the gaze of a man who had spent the previous 7 days in the silence of his cell, replaying the catastrophic arc of his ambition and confronting, in the unforgiving mirror of solitude, the full, unvarnished truth of what he had become. He was dressed in plain, unadorned garments, stripped of the insignia of rank and the accoutrements of power that had once defined his identity, and the absence of these external markers seemed to diminish him physically, reducing him from the imposing, commanding figure that had once dominated the battlefields and the council chambers of the frontier to a man of ordinary stature and ordinary bearing, indistinguishable from the thousands of other men who had passed through this hall over the centuries. Each one convinced of the uniqueness and the importance of his own story, each one ultimately subject to the same impartial, indiscriminate scales of justice. The charges were read aloud by the court scribe, a thin, bespectacled man whose voice carried with surprising authority through the vast, echoing space, each accusation landing upon the assembled crowd like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock and outrage spreading outward through the galleries. Conspiracy against the Ottoman state, the recruitment and deployment of foreign mercenaries for the purpose of overthrowing the legitimate sovereign. Complicity in the assassination of Boran, commander of the frontier forces and brother of Jakarta Sahib, the deliberate manipulation of the Kechik people through false promises and fabricated intelligence, the attempted murder of Sultan Arhin Sahib during the siege at Kara Hisar. Each charge was supported by evidence, meticulously gathered and organized by Shamil, whose legal mind was as sharp and as disciplined as any blade in the Ottoman arsenal, evidence that included intercepted letters, testimony from captured soldiers, the physical documentation seized from Damir Khan's personal quarters, and the sworn statements of the Kechik commander, whose account of the conspiracy to betray his people after the battle had been recorded, verified, and entered into the official record with the scrupulous attention to detail that was the hallmark of Ottoman judicial procedure. Damir Khan was given the opportunity to speak in his own defense, a right guaranteed by the legal code that Arhin had inherited from his father and that he was determined to uphold, even for the most despicable of defendants, because the integrity of the law depended not on its application to the deserving, but on its application to all, without exception, without favoritism, without the corrosive, self-defeating selectivity that transformed justice into vengeance and the rule of law into the rule of the strong. Damir Khan rose to his feet, and for a moment, a brief shimmering moment that hung in the air like the last note of a dying song, the hall held its breath, waiting to see what the fallen commander would say, what defense he would offer, what justification he would present for the trail of blood and betrayal that stretched behind him like the wake of a sinking ship. And Damir Khan, to the surprise of nearly everyone present, did not deny the charges. He did not protest his innocence or plead for mercy or attempt to shift the blame to his co-conspirators. Instead, he stood in the center of the great hall, surrounded by the silent, watchful faces of 1,000 of his former countrymen, and he spoke with a quiet, measured dignity that was all the more devastating for its unexpectedness, admitting that he had conspired against the Ottoman state, that he had recruited mercenaries and plotted the Sultan's downfall, that he had been complicit in the death of Boran and the attempted destruction of the Kayı. But he did not apologize. He did not express remorse. Instead, he stated with the cold, unflinching honesty of a man who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to hide, that he had acted not out of personal malice or greed, but out of a genuine, deeply held conviction that the expansion of Ottoman power represented an existential threat to the independence and the way of life of the frontier peoples, the Kechik, the border clans, the small, proud, fiercely independent communities that had governed themselves for generations, and that now faced absorption into an empire that, however benevolent its intentions, would inevitably erase their identities, subsume their cultures, and reduce them from free peoples to subjects of a foreign crown. The whole erupted. The crowd, which had been expecting groveling and contrition, was instead confronted with a defense that was, in its own way, more troubling than any lie, because it contained within it a grain of truth, a kernel of legitimate grievance that could not be simply dismissed or shouted down, a reminder that the expansion of every empire, however righteous its cause, came at a cost that was paid not by the conquerors but by the conquered, and that the stories of the vanquished, however inconvenient and however uncomfortable, deserved to be heard, if only so that the victors could understand the full human dimensions of the world they were building. Arhin listened to Damir Khan's defense with an expression that betrayed nothing of the complex, conflicting emotions that churned beneath the surface of his composure, and when the fallen commander had finished speaking and the uproar had subsided into a tense, expectant murmur, the Sultan rose from his throne and addressed the court. He acknowledged, with a candor that stunned his own commanders and set the diplomatic observers scribbling furiously in their notebooks, that Damir Khan's concerns about the impact of Ottoman expansion on the frontier peoples were not entirely without foundation, that the process of incorporation was complex and fraught with potential for injustice, and that it was the duty of the Ottoman state, a duty he took with the utmost seriousness, to ensure that the rights, the traditions, and the dignity of every people who came under its protection were respected and preserved. But he also stated, with equal clarity and equal force, that the method Damir Khan had chosen to address his grievances, conspiracy, assassination, the recruitment of foreign mercenaries, the manipulation of innocent peoples for personal gain, was not merely illegal but morally reprehensible, a betrayal not only of the Ottoman state but of the very values of independence and honor that Damir Khan claimed to be defending. A man who slaughters innocents in the name of freedom, Arhin declared, his voice resonating through the hall with the force of a struck bell, has surrendered his claim to freedom, and a commander who sacrifices his own soldiers on the altar of his ambition has forfeited his right to command. The verdict was delivered by the Council of Scholars after a deliberation that lasted less than an hour, a unanimity that reflected not haste but the overwhelming, incontrovertible weight of the evidence. Damir Khan was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to permanent imprisonment in the fortress of Bolu, a remote, heavily fortified installation in the mountains from which no prisoner had ever escaped, a sentence that was in many ways more severe than death, for it condemned the once proud commander to a lifetime of enforced reflection, stripped of the power, the status, and the freedom that had defined his existence, left alone with the echoing, inescapable company of his own thoughts and the relentless, grinding knowledge that every day of his remaining life would be spent within the same four walls, watching the same small patch of sky through the same narrow window, until time itself had worn away the last traces of the man he had once been and left behind only a memory, a cautionary tale, a name whispered in the dark to remind the ambitious and the reckless that the price of treason was not a clean, dramatic death, but a slow, suffocating, interminable erasure. Damir Khan received the sentence without visible emotion, his face as still and as blank as a freshly plastered wall, and as the guards led him from the hall, he paused for a single, momentary heartbeat at the threshold, turning his head to look back at Arhin with an expression that was impossible to read, an expression that might have been hatred or respect or resignation or some unfathomable combination of all three, and then he was gone, swallowed by the corridor's shadows, his footsteps fading into the stone silence of the palace's lower levels, and the great hall exhaled a collective breath that it had not realized it had been holding. The interlude between the two trials was brief, barely enough time for the crowd to shift in their seats and the scribes to sharpen their quills, but it felt like an eternity, a vast, pregnant pause in which the air itself seemed to thicken and congeal, as if the atmosphere were bracing itself for the emotional onslaught that it knew was coming. When Yaqid was brought in, the reaction was immediate, visceral, and terrifying in its intensity. Unlike the controlled, resentful silence that had greeted Damir Khan, Yaqid's entrance was met with a roar of fury so raw, so primal, so saturated with the specific, personal, intimate pain of betrayal that it seemed to physically push the prisoner backward, staggering him on his feet as if he had been struck by a gust of hurricane-force wind. This was not the abstract political anger of a populace confronting a foreign enemy. This was the scorching, white-hot rage of a community confronting one of its own who had turned against them, a brother who had sold his family, a soldier who had opened the gate to the enemy, a man who had worn their colors and shared their bread and prayed beside them in the mosque, and then when the moment of testing came had revealed himself to be hollow, rotten, a vessel of poison disguised as a chalice of fellowship. Women screamed curses from the galleries, Men pressed against the barriers with clenched fists and bared teeth, and children who had been brought by their parents to witness the workings of justice stared with wide, frightened eyes at the spectacle of collective fury that swirled around the trembling, stumbling figure of the traitor like a maelstrom around a sinking ship. Arhin allowed the rage to spend itself, understanding that the catharsis of expression was a necessary component of the healing process, that a wound that was covered before it had been cleaned would only fester and spread, and that the people needed to voice their pain before they could begin the long, difficult work of moving past it. But when the roar had subsided to a seething, ominous murmur, he raised his hand, and the silence that fell was absolute, instantaneous, a testament to the depth of the authority he wielded and the trust that his people placed in his judgment. The charges against Yaqid were read with the same methodical thoroughness that had characterized the previous trial, but the list was longer, more detailed, and more damning, because Yaqid's treachery was not merely a political act but a personal one, a violation not just of the law but of the sacred, fundamental bonds of loyalty and brotherhood that held the Ottoman society together at its most basic molecular level. He was charged with espionage, with the transmission of military intelligence to the enemy, with the deliberate sabotage of defensive preparations, with complicity in the planning and execution of the ambush that had resulted in Boran's death, and with the attempted assassination of Sultan Arhin during the confrontation at Kara Hisar. Each charge was supported by evidence that was presented with painstaking, relentless precision, the documents, the witness statements, the physical artifacts, all arranged and displayed with the care and the reverence of a prosecutor who understood that he was not merely trying a case but building a monument, a permanent, irrefutable record of treachery that would serve as a warning and a reference for generations to come. Yaqid, unlike Damir Khan, did not stand with dignity or speak with conviction. He crumpled. He collapsed onto the stone floor of the great hall like a puppet whose strings had been cut, his body folding in on itself, his hands clutching his head, his mouth open in a soundless scream that was more disturbing, more harrowing, more deeply unsettling than any howl of anguish could have been, because it conveyed not just fear or pain but the total, catastrophic disintegration of a human personality, the final, irreversible collapse of the internal architecture of denial and self-justification that had allowed him to commit his crimes while still, in some dark, protected corner of his mind, believing himself to be a rational, justified, even heroic actor in the drama of his own life. That architecture was gone now, swept away by the crushing, inescapable reality of public judgment, and what remained was not a man but a ruin, a collection of broken fragments that no longer fit together, that could no longer form a coherent whole, that would never again assemble themselves into anything recognizable as a functioning human being. When he was asked to speak in his own defense, Yaqid attempted to rise, failed, attempted again, and finally managed to achieve a position that was neither standing nor kneeling but somewhere in between, a grotesque, pitiful crouch that seemed to embody the fundamental neither here nor there-ness of his existence, the tragic self-inflicted limbo of a man who belonged nowhere, who was claimed by no one, who had severed every connection, burned every bridge, and poisoned every well, leaving himself stranded in a wasteland of his own creation. His voice, when it came, was a barely audible whisper that the scribes had to strain to hear, a broken, stammering, incoherent stream of words that tumbled from his lips like debris from a collapsed building, fragments of confession mixed with shards of justification mixed with splinters of pleading, the whole mass held together by nothing but the desperate, futile hope that somewhere within the wreckage there might be a word, a phrase, a syllable that would somehow, impossibly, magically undo what had been done and restore what had been destroyed. He spoke of Shahanshah's promises, of the gold and the titles and the lands that had been offered to him in exchange for his loyalty, and how those promises had seemed at the time so reasonable, so logical, so compelling that resistance had felt not just futile but foolish, like standing in front of a river and commanding it to flow uphill. He spoke of his growing resentment toward the House of Osman, a resentment that he now recognized as the poisonous fruit of his own envy and ambition, but that at the time had felt like a righteous, justified anger, a noble grievance against a system that had failed to reward his talents and recognize his worth. And he spoke of Boran, and when he did, the entire hall seemed to contract, the air growing thick and heavy and suffocating, as if the collective grief and rage of every person present had suddenly concentrated into a single, unbearable point of pressure that threatened to crack the very foundations of the building. He said that he had not intended Boran's death, that it had not been part of the plan, that things had spiraled out of control in ways he had not foreseen and could not have prevented. And even as the words left his lips, he seemed to recognize their hollowness, their inadequacy, the grotesque insufficiency of claiming that the murder of a hero was an accident, an oversight, a regrettable but unintended consequence of actions that were themselves deliberate, calculated, and malicious. He stopped speaking mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open, his eyes staring at some invisible point in the middle distance, and the silence that followed was not the silence of contemplation or judgment, but the silence of an abyss, a void so deep and so dark that no sound, no word, no prayer could bridge it. Jakarta Sahib sat in the front row of the gallery, directly across from the prisoner, and throughout Yakid's testimony, he had remained absolutely motionless, his face a mask of stone, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the traitor with an intensity that seemed to bore through flesh and bone and reach into the very marrow of the man's corrupted soul. When Yakid mentioned Boran's name, a muscle twitched in Jakarta's jaw, a single, tiny, almost invisible movement that was the only outward sign of the volcanic, earth-shattering fury that was raging beneath the surface of his composure, a fury that he held in check not because he lacked the desire or the ability to unleash it, but because his sultan had asked him to trust the process, to believe in the law. To let the system of justice that Osman Sahib had built and Arhin had inherited do its work, and Jakarta, despite every fiber of his warrior's soul screaming for blood, honored that request with the same unwavering, unconditional loyalty that he had given to the House of Osman since the day he had first drawn his sword in its service. He did not move, he did not speak. He simply sat and watched and let his presence, the silent, immovable, indestructible presence of a man whose love for his fallen brother was stronger than his hatred for his brother's killer, speak the volumes that his lips refused to utter. The verdict was again unanimous, the scholars requiring even less time to deliberate than they had for Damir Khan, the evidence so overwhelming and the crime so severe that the decision was, in truth, a formality, a legal confirmation of what every person in the hall already knew with absolute certainty. Yakid was found guilty on all counts, and the sentence, when it was pronounced, fell upon the hall like the blade of an executioner's sword, final, irreversible, and terrible in its simplicity: death. The traitor would be executed at dawn on the following day in the public square before the great mosque, his punishment witnessed by the people he had betrayed, his end a declaration to the world that the Ottoman state, for all its mercy and all its magnanimity, drew an absolute, inviolable line at the betrayal of one's own brothers in arms, and that those who crossed that line would pay the ultimate price, not out of cruelty or vengeance but out of the cold, necessary, sorrowful recognition that some acts of treachery were so fundamental, so corrosive, so destructive to the basic fabric of trust upon which all civilization depended, that the only adequate response was the permanent, irrevocable removal of the guilty from the community of the living. Yakid received the sentence in silence, his head bowed, his body still, and as the guards lifted him to his feet and began to lead him from the hall, he turned his head not toward the Sultan and not toward the crowd but toward Jakarta, and the two men's eyes met across the vast, echoing expanse of the great hall. And in that look, that final, wordless exchange between the man who had killed a brother and the man whose brother had been killed, there passed something that defied description and transcended judgment, something that existed in the borderland between hatred and sorrow, between justice and mercy, between the human need for retribution and the human capacity for compassion, a look that acknowledged, without words and without resolution, the terrible, irreducible complexity of the human condition, the fact that the same species that could produce a Boran could also produce a Yakid, that the same heart that was capable of the most selfless love was also capable of the most devastating betrayal, and that the distance between the two was not the vast, uncrossable chasm that we pretend it to be, but a narrow, terrifying, paper-thin line that every human being walked every day of their life, 1 foot in the light and 1 foot in the shadow, the balance maintained only by the choices we make, moment by moment, breath by breath, in the endless, unforgiving, magnificent struggle to be worthy of the divine spark that burned within us. The execution was carried out at dawn, as decreed, in the pale, grey, colourless light of a morning that seemed to have been drained of all warmth and all beauty, as if the sky itself were mourning the necessity of what was about to occur. The square before the great mosque was filled with people, thousands upon thousands of them standing in silence, their breath forming small clouds in the cold, still air, their faces pale and solemn, their eyes fixed on the raised platform at the centre of the square where the executioner stood, his blade gleaming dully in the weak light, his face hidden behind the traditional mask that served not to conceal his identity, but to symbolize the impersonality of justice. The principle that the punishment was delivered not by a man but by the law, not out of personal malice, but out of institutional necessity. Yakid was led to the platform by guards whose faces were as solemn and as expressionless as the mask of the executioner, and he walked with the slow, shuffling, dreamlike gait of a man who had already departed the world of the living and was merely going through the motions of a physical process that had no further relevance to the journey his soul had already begun. He was offered the opportunity to speak, and he declined, shaking his head with a small, weary movement that suggested not defiance but exhaustion, the bone-deep, soul-crushing exhaustion of a man who had run out of words and found, at the very end, that silence was the only honest language left to him. He knelt, and the executioner raised his blade, and the crowd held its breath, and somewhere in the distance a bird sang a single, clear, piercingly beautiful note that cut through the silence like a thread of gold through a tapestry of grey. And then the blade fell, and it was done, and the crowd exhaled, and the bird fell silent, and the morning, which had been holding itself in a state of suspended, breathless anticipation, resumed its slow, inevitable progress toward the full, blazing light of day. Arhin Sahib did not attend the execution. He stood instead at the window of his private chamber in the palace, looking out over the city, his hands clasped behind his back, his face turned toward the east where the first, faint blush of dawn was beginning to paint the horizon with strokes of rose and amber and the palest, most delicate shade of lavender. He had made the decision not to attend deliberately, not out of cowardice or squeamishness, but out of a deeply held conviction that the taking of a life, even a life that the law demanded be taken, was not a spectacle to be witnessed by a sovereign but a burden to be borne in private, a weight to be added to the already crushing load of responsibility that pressed down upon the shoulders of every ruler who understood that the power to dispense justice was not a privilege but a curse, a terrible, inescapable obligation that stained the hands and scarred the soul of every man who wielded it, regardless of how justly or how mercifully it was applied. He heard the distant, muffled sound of the crowd's collective exhalation, and he knew without needing to be told that the sentence had been carried out, and he closed his eyes, whispering a prayer not for himself but for the soul of the man who had just departed, a prayer that asked not for forgiveness, for that was between Yaqid and his creator, but for understanding, the understanding that comes only in the hereafter. When the veils of ego and ambition and self-deception are stripped away, and the soul stands naked before the infinite, unflinching, compassionate gaze of the Almighty, seeing itself, perhaps for the first time, as it truly is. The days that followed the trials were days of transition, of the slow, difficult, necessary work of moving from war to governance, from crisis to stability, from the reactive, adrenaline-fueled intensity of combat to the steady, patient, infinitely more demanding labor of building a just and enduring peace. Arhin threw himself into this work with the same tireless, focused energy that he had brought to the battlefield, meeting with his advisors from dawn until well past midnight, reviewing reports, issuing directives, receiving petitions from citizens whose grievances ranged from the profound to the mundane, and navigating the complex, constantly shifting landscape of intertribal politics with the deft, instinctive skill of a man who understood that the art of governance was not the imposition of order upon chaos, but the cultivation of consensus among competing interests, a process that required not just intelligence and authority, but empathy, patience, and the willingness to listen, truly listen, to voices that disagreed with his own. He reformed the frontier administration, implementing new policies designed to protect the rights and the autonomy of the local peoples while maintaining the overall coherence and the defensive capability of the Ottoman state. He expanded the judicial system, appointing new judges and establishing new courts in the outlying regions, ensuring that the promise of justice that he had made in the Great Hall was not an empty proclamation, but a living, breathing reality that reached into every village, every settlement, every isolated mountain community that fell under his protection. He invested in infrastructure, commissioning the construction of roads, bridges, and caravanserais that would facilitate trade, communication, and the movement of troops, knitting the scattered, disparate territories of the state into a single, integrated, mutually supporting network that was greater than the sum of its parts. And through it all, he tended to the personal, the intimate, the domestic dimensions of his life that the demands of war had forced him to neglect. He sat with Gonka and held his newborn son, feeling the tiny, insistent grip of the child's fingers around his own, and marveling at the absurd, miraculous, overwhelming fragility and strength of new life. He walked with Malhan in the palace gardens, their conversations ranging from the strategic to the personal to the philosophical, the easy, flowing dialogue of two minds that had been honed by years of shared experience and mutual respect into instruments of remarkable harmony. He spoke with Nilüfer carefully, diplomatically, acknowledging her strengths while gently but firmly redirecting the sharp edges of her personality away from the destructive channels into which they had been flowing and toward more constructive, more productive outlets, a process that was as delicate and as demanding as any diplomatic negotiation, and that required every ounce of the patience, the tact, and the emotional intelligence that he possessed. And he sat with a sporcher alone in the quiet, lamplit intimacy of his private chamber, and they spoke, for the first time truly spoke, not as sultan and consort, not as political partners bound by treaty and necessity, but as two human beings who had been thrown together by forces beyond their control and who were now haltingly, tentatively, with all the awkwardness and the vulnerability of two strangers learning to share a life, trying to find in each other something real, something genuine, something that transcended the roles and the titles, and the expectations that had been imposed upon them by the world. Esportia told him of her vision in the forest, of seeing his face and hearing his voice and feeling, for the first time since her arrival in the Ottoman lands, that she was not a pawn but a person, not a symbol but a soul, and Arhin listened with an attention that was total, complete, and utterly free of judgment. And when she had finished, he told her in a voice that was quiet and rough and full of a tenderness that he rarely allowed himself to express, that the strength she had found in that forest was not something he had given her but something that had always been within her, waiting to be discovered, and that his only role had been to hold up a mirror in which she could see what the rest of the world had been too blind or too busy or too afraid to notice. The nights grew longer as autumn deepened its hold upon the land, the days shorter, the air crisper, the sky a deeper, more saturated shade of blue that seemed to darken and intensify with each passing week, as if the heavens themselves were bracing for the long, cold, testing months of winter that lay ahead. And in the quiet, still hours before dawn, when the palace slept and the city dreamed and the only sounds were the distant calls of the muezzin and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the sentries on the walls, Orhan Sahib sat at his desk, the dispatch from Faladios open before him, its contents a reminder that the peace they were building was not a fortress but a fire, fragile, vulnerable, dependent for its survival on constant attention and endless fuel, and that somewhere out there, in the darkness beyond the reach of the lamplight, Shahanshah was watching, waiting, planning, his patience infinite, his malice undimmed, his web slowly, silently, inexorably expanding, reaching toward the heart of the Ottoman state with the cold, creeping tenacity of frost spreading across a windowpane. And Arhin looked at the dispatch, and he looked at the lamp, and he looked at the darkness that pressed against the window like a living thing, and he understood with the calm, clear-eyed acceptance of a man who had long ago made his peace with the nature of his calling, that the war would never truly end, that it would merely change its shape, shifting from the battlefield to the council chamber, from the sword to the pen, from the clash of armies to the clash of ideas. And that the price of the civilization he was building was not a single payment, but a perpetual, never-ending installment, extracted daily in the currency of vigilance, sacrifice, wisdom, and the quiet, stubborn, unyielding refusal to let the darkness have the last word. He picked up his pen, dipped it in ink, and began to write, and the scratching of the nib upon the parchment was the only sound in the room, small, steady, persistent, the sound of a man building the future one word at a time, one decision at a time, one breath at a time, in the endless, beautiful, terrible, magnificent endeavor of holding back the night, and waiting for the dawn that he knew, with the unshakable faith of a believer and the hard-won wisdom of a king, would come, would always come. Not because the darkness was weak, but because the light, however small, however battered, however besieged, was stronger, had always been stronger, would always be stronger, for as long as there were men and women willing to tend its flame and pass it, burning and undiminished, from one generation to the next, across the vast, unknowable, breathtaking expanse of time. The winter came not gradually, but with the sudden, violent ferocity of a conqueror descending upon an unprepared land, the first snows falling in thick, relentless curtains that transformed the familiar landscape into an alien, white, silent world in which distances became deceptive, roads became treacherous, and the ordinary rhythms of daily life were disrupted, distorted, and reshaped by the implacable, indifferent power of nature asserting its dominion over the plans and the ambitions of men. The mountains that ringed the Ottoman heartland disappeared behind walls of swirling white, their passes sealed by drifts that rose higher with each passing storm, cutting off the outlying settlements from the capital and transforming each village, each garrison, each isolated outpost into a self-contained universe, dependent entirely on its own resources, its own courage, and its own ingenuity for survival. The army, which had been deployed along the frontier in a series of fortified positions designed to deter any opportunistic attack during the transition from war to peace, found itself engaged not in the glamorous, dramatic combat of the battlefield, but in the grinding, unglamorous, essential struggle against cold, hunger, boredom, and the slow, insidious erosion of morale that winter inflicted upon even the most disciplined and motivated fighting force. Tarhan, who had been stationed at the forward observation post near the border of the neighboring state from which Shahanshah was conducting his diplomatic offensive, sent regular dispatches that arrived at the capital days or sometimes weeks after they were written, delayed by the snow and the treacherous condition of the roads, and their contents painted a picture of patient, meticulous intelligence gathering conducted under conditions of extraordinary hardship. His small team of scouts enduring sub-zero temperatures, limited rations, and the constant, nerve-shredding awareness that discovery by the enemy would mean not just death, but the exposure of the entire Ottoman intelligence network in the region. Orhan Sahib received each dispatch with the same grave, attentive focus that he brought to every piece of information that crossed his desk, reading each word carefully, cross-referencing each observation with the reports that arrived from other sources, gradually assembling in his mind a comprehensive, three-dimensional map of the enemy's intentions, capabilities, and vulnerabilities that grew more detailed and more accurate with each passing week. The picture that emerged was troubling but not surprising, a portrait of Shahanshah as a tireless, endlessly adaptable adversary who was using his enforced exile not as a period of defeat and retreat, but as an opportunity to reinvent himself, to rebuild his networks, and to cultivate new alliances that would eventually, inevitably, be turned against the Ottoman state. Arhin reported that Shahanshah had established himself as a valued advisor to the neighboring ruler, offering his deep knowledge of Ottoman military tactics, political structures, and strategic vulnerabilities in exchange for the protection and the resources he needed to continue his campaign of subversion. He had been granted a small but well-appointed residence within the court compound, furnished with servants, guards, and a steady stream of visitors whose identities Arhin's agents were working to catalogue. Visitors who included not just the expected array of disaffected Ottoman exiles and frontier bandits, but also representatives from more distant and more powerful states, whose interest in the Ottoman question was a clear indication that Shahanshah's anti-Ottoman coalition was gaining traction, attracting attention, and beginning to coalesce into something that could no longer be dismissed as the fantasies of a defeated, desperate man. But winter, for all its hardships, also provided opportunities, and Arhin used the enforced pause in military operations to invest in the internal strengthening of the state, the quiet, patient, foundational work that would ultimately determine the outcome of the longer struggle far more decisively than any single battle or military campaign. He convened a series of councils that brought together the leading minds of the Ottoman world, scholars, jurists, administrators, merchants, military commanders, and representatives of the various peoples and communities that made up the diverse, complex mosaic of the emerging empire, and he listened to their perspectives, their grievances, their suggestions, and their visions for the future with an openness and a genuine curiosity that earned him not just their respect but their trust. A commodity far more valuable and far more difficult to acquire than any territory or treasure. The councils produced a body of legislation that would become the foundation of Ottoman governance for generations, laws that addressed everything from property rights and commercial regulation to criminal justice and the administration of religious endowments, each provision debated, refined, and tested against the dual standards of divine law and practical necessity, until it achieved the delicate, difficult balance between idealism and realism that was the hallmark of effective governance. Arhin presided over each session with the focused, tireless attention of a man who understood that the true battlefield of empire was not the frontier but the law, that the strength of a state was measured not by the size of its army but by the justice of its institutions, and that the legacy he left to his successors would be judged not by the number of cities he had conquered, but by the quality of the civilization he had built. Within the palace, the dynamics of the household continued to evolve in ways that were sometimes encouraging, sometimes frustrating, and always complex, the interactions between the women of the court reflecting in miniature the larger political and social forces that shaped the world beyond the walls. Nilüfer Hatun remained the anchor of the household, her authority undiminished, her judgment respected, her presence a source of stability and reassurance in a world that seemed determined to test the limits of human endurance. She managed the domestic affairs of the palace with the same strategic acumen that she brought to the political arena, balancing the competing needs and demands of a household that included not just the Sultan's immediate family but a vast, interconnected network of relatives, retainers, servants, advisors, and hangers-on whose loyalties, rivalries, and personal dramas constituted a political ecosystem as intricate and as volatile as the court itself. She mediated disputes, allocated resources, maintained discipline, and above all, projected the calm, confident, unflappable demeanor of a woman who had seen everything, survived everything, and was prepared for everything, a demeanor that was, in truth, the product of constant, exhausting, invisible effort, the result of countless sleepless nights, suppressed anxieties, and the daily, grinding discipline of subordinating her own needs, her own fears, and her own desires to the overriding imperative of holding the household together. The relationship between Nilüfer and Asporça had entered a new, cautiously optimistic phase, the open hostility of the previous months giving way to a wary, tentative, heavily conditioned détente that was less a genuine reconciliation than a pragmatic ceasefire, both women having recognized in the aftermath of the crisis that their continued antagonism was not just destructive to the household but potentially dangerous to the state. A vulnerability that external enemies could and would exploit if given the opportunity. Nilüfer, who had been privately and profoundly shaken by the realization that her treatment of Asporça had contributed to the princess's flight and the subsequent chain of events that had nearly resulted in catastrophe, had retreated into a period of uncharacteristic introspection, her usual sharp tongue quieted, her restless energy redirected from political maneuvering to the more constructive pursuits of education and household management. She spent long hours in the library, studying the histories of the great empires that had preceded the Ottomans, searching for patterns, for lessons, for the key to the question that had begun to obsess her: how did civilizations endure? What internal forces held them together when external pressures threatened to tear them apart? And what role did the women of the court, the mothers and the wives and the daughters whose influence was wielded not through the sword but through the subtler, more durable instruments of counsel, education, and moral authority, play in determining whether a dynasty rose to greatness or collapsed into the rubble of its own contradictions? The answers she found were not simple, not comforting, not the neat, reassuring formulas that her practical, results-oriented mind craved, but they were illuminating, and they forced her slowly, reluctantly, painfully, to confront the possibility that the world was more complex, more nuanced, and more resistant to her control than she had previously been willing to admit. Esportia, for her part, had begun the slow, difficult process of rebuilding her place within the household, a process that required not just the external adjustments of behavior and protocol, but the deeper, more fundamental work of redefining her own identity, of discovering who she was apart from the roles and the expectations that had been imposed upon her by her father, her culture, and the political circumstances of her marriage. Fatima Hatun had become an unexpected ally in this process, the bond that had been formed beside the forest stream deepening and strengthening with each passing week into something that was, if not quite friendship in the conventional sense, then certainly a relationship of mutual respect, honest communication, and genuine, if sometimes painful, accountability. Fatima did not coddle Esportia or shield her from the harsh realities of her situation, but neither did she condemn or judge, and the balanced, unflinching honesty of her approach provided Esportia with something she had never before experienced: a mirror that reflected not the distorted, politically motivated image that others wanted her to see, but the true, unvarnished, complicated, and ultimately hopeful reality of who she actually was. The two women met regularly, sometimes in the garden, sometimes in Fatima's private quarters, sometimes on the walls of the palace where the winter wind bit at their faces and the snow swirled around their cloaks, and they talked about everything and nothing, about the politics of the court and the politics of the heart, about duty and desire, about the impossible, beautiful, terrifying challenge of being a woman in a world that was designed and governed by men, and about the quiet, stubborn, revolutionary act of claiming one's own voice in a culture that had not yet learned to listen. Gonka's recovery from childbirth was slow but steady, her body gradually regaining its strength while her mind wrestled with the new, overwhelming, all-consuming reality of motherhood. The child, a boy who had been named in a private ceremony attended only by the immediate family, was healthy and vigorous, his appetite prodigious, his lungs powerful, his tiny, fierce, uncompromising will already asserting itself in the form of midnight screams that echoed through the palace corridors and provoked a range of responses from the household: amused tolerance from the servants, resigned exasperation from the guards, and from Malhun a deep, quiet, trembling joy that she expressed not in words but in the gentle, reverent touch of her fingertips upon the child's forehead whenever she visited the nursery, a touch that connected the present to the past and the past to the future in a chain of love and continuity that stretched back through the generations to the very foundations of the House of Osman. Nilüfer, whose earlier coldness toward Gonka's pregnancy had been a source of tension and concern, surprised everyone by becoming an attentive and devoted aunt, spending hours in the nursery, holding the child, singing to him in a soft, unexpectedly beautiful voice that revealed a dimension of her personality that her public persona had never permitted to emerge, a tenderness, a capacity for uncomplicated, unconditional love that existed beneath the armor of her ambition, and her intellect, like a spring of clear water, bubbling up through layers of hard, unyielding rock. The winter solstice came and went, the shortest day and the longest night of the year, and as the calendar turned and the days began almost imperceptibly to lengthen, the palace settled into a rhythm that was, if not precisely peaceful, then at least stable, a managed, monitored, carefully calibrated equilibrium that required constant attention and adjustment, but that for the time being held. Orhan used the quieter evenings to sit with his son, cradling the small, warm, impossibly fragile bundle against his chest, feeling the heartbeat that fluttered beneath the thin layer of skin and muscle like the wings of a hummingbird, and he spoke to the child in a low, murmuring voice, telling him stories that the infant could not possibly understand but that the father needed to tell, stories of Osman Saheb and his vision, of Boran and his sacrifice, of the battles that had been fought and the prices that had been paid, and the dreams that had been dreamed in the long, bloody, magnificent history of the family into which this child had been born. He told the boy about justice, about mercy, about the difference between power and authority, about the sacred, inviolable responsibility of the strong toward the weak, and about the one truth that superseded all others, that a man's worth was measured not by what he took from the world but by what he gave to it, not by the enemies he defeated but by the friends he defended, not by the height of his throne but by the depth of his compassion. And as the child slept, his tiny fist curled around his father's finger, Orhan looked out the window at the snow-covered landscape, the white, silent, pristine world that stretched to the horizon in every direction, and he allowed himself for a few precious, stolen moments to feel not the weight of the crown or the burden of the sword or the pressure of the endless, grinding, relentless demands of empire, but simply the warmth of his son's body against his chest, the soft, rhythmic breathing of the sleeping child, and the quiet, profound, transcendent gratitude of a man who understood in the deepest chambers of his heart that this small, fragile, impossibly beautiful life was what all the fighting was for, what all the sacrifice was about, what all the pain and the blood and the tears had been spent to protect and to preserve and to pass on undiminished and undefiled to the generations yet to come. But the peace of winter was a borrowed peace, a temporary truce negotiated not between men but between seasons, and as the first, tentative signs of spring began to appear, the crocuses pushing through the thinning snow, the rivers swelling with meltwater, the birds returning from their southern exile to fill the morning air with their assertive, territorial songs, the machinery of conflict began to stir again, creaking and groaning as it emerged from its winter hibernation and prepared for the campaigns that the warmer months would inevitably bring. Arhin's dispatches, which had become less frequent during the deepest, coldest weeks of winter when the mountain passes were completely impassable, began to arrive again with increasing regularity, and their contents reflected a shift in tone that was subtle but unmistakable, the careful, measured language of intelligence gathering giving way to the more urgent, more pointed cadences of tactical assessment. Shahanshah, it seemed, had not been idle during the winter months, far from it. He had used the enforced pause to consolidate his position at the neighboring court, deepening his relationship with the ruler, expanding his network of informants and agents, and quietly, systematically recruiting a new army from the diverse pool of disaffected soldiers, displaced refugees, and professional mercenaries that the turbulent political landscape of the region provided in seemingly inexhaustible supply. Arhin estimated the force at somewhere between 300 and 400 men, not large enough to threaten the Ottoman state directly but more than sufficient to cause serious damage to the frontier settlements, to disrupt trade, to terrorize the civilian population, and to create the kind of instability and insecurity that would undermine public confidence in the Sultan's ability to protect his people, the ultimate weapon in Shahanshah's campaign of subversion. The intelligence was supplemented by reports from Faladios, who had spent the winter in the Kechik heartlands, nurturing the alliance and monitoring the border from the opposite direction. Faladios reported that the Kechik had honored their commitments faithfully, maintaining their patrols, sharing intelligence, and providing logistical support to the Ottoman garrisons along the shared frontier, but he also warned that the alliance, while solid, was not invulnerable. The Kechik commander, whose personal commitment to the partnership was genuine and unwavering, faced growing opposition from a faction within his own ranks that viewed the alliance with the Ottomans as a surrender of independence, a capitulation to a foreign power that would eventually absorb the Kechik, just as it had absorbed so many other peoples before them. The faction was small but vocal, its arguments resonating with the younger, more idealistic warriors who had not yet learned to distinguish between the rhetoric of independence and the reality of survival, and Faladios cautioned that if the opposition were not addressed promptly and effectively, it could develop into a serious threat to the alliance's stability, providing Shahanshah with an opening that he would not hesitate to exploit. Orhan absorbed the intelligence, processed it, and began the complex, multi-layered process of strategic planning that would define the coming season. He summoned his full war council, the first time the complete roster of senior commanders had been assembled since the trials, and the great hall that had so recently served as a court of justice was transformed into a war room, the walls hung with maps, the tables covered with dispatches and intelligence summaries, the air thick with the smoke of oil lamps and the low, intense murmur of men debating the future of their nation with the focused, passionate urgency of those who understood that the decisions they made in this room would determine whether the civilization they were building would endure or crumble, whether the sacrifices of the past would be honored or wasted, whether the flame that had been kindled in the darkness would grow into a blazing, unquenchable fire or be snuffed out by the cold, indifferent winds of history. Arhin had returned from the border for the council, his face leaner and harder than ever, the months of privation and constant vigilance having stripped away every last trace of softness and left behind only the essential, irreducible core of the warrior, a core that was as hard and as sharp as the blade he carried. Faladios had sent a detailed written brief, unable to leave the Kechik territories at such a critical juncture, but contributing his analysis and his recommendations through the precise, incisive prose that was the hallmark of his formidable intellect. Jakarta Abdul Rahman, Shamal, Zarkan, Kulads Kilil, Tamir Boga, Mustafa and Altadin Sahib all took their places around the great table, each man bringing to the discussion his own unique perspective, his own particular expertise and his own deeply held convictions about the best path forward. The debate was long, intense, and at times fiercely contentious, the commanders arguing with the passionate, unrestrained honesty of men who trusted each other enough to disagree openly, knowing that the friction of conflicting ideas would ultimately produce a strategy that was stronger, more resilient, and more comprehensive than any single mind could have conceived alone. Abdul Rahman, true to form, advocated a preemptive strike, arguing that waiting for Shahanshah to make the first move was tantamount to handing him the initiative and allowing him to choose the time, the place, and the terms of the engagement. Shamal countered that a preemptive strike would play directly into Shahanshah's narrative of Ottoman aggression, alienating the neutral states and potentially accelerating the formation of the very coalition they were trying to prevent. Jakarta, whose strategic thinking had been sharpened and deepened by the crucible of his grief and his subsequent emotional reckoning, proposed a middle path, a strategy of active defense that combined the fortification and reinforcement of the frontier with targeted covert operations designed to disrupt Shahanshah's recruitment efforts, sabotage his supply lines, and sow discord among his allies. Tarhin supported this approach, adding that his intelligence network, properly resourced and expanded, could provide the early warning capability that would allow the Ottoman forces to respond rapidly and decisively to any provocation, without the need for a costly, politically damaging preemptive campaign. Arhin listened to every argument, weighed every option, and when the debate had exhausted itself and the commanders sat in silence waiting for their sultan to speak, he rose from his chair, walked to the great map that dominated the eastern wall of the hall, and traced with the tip of his finger the line of the frontier from the northern mountains to the southern plains, his touch light and precise, as if he were reading a text written in a language that only he could understand. And then he turned to face his commanders, and he laid out his strategy with the calm, unhurried, devastating clarity that was the signature of his leadership, a strategy that incorporated elements of every proposal that had been presented but that transcended them all, weaving them together into a coherent, integrated, devastatingly effective whole that addressed not just the immediate military threat but the deeper, more fundamental political, economic, and social dimensions of the challenge they faced. The strategy had three pillars. The first was military readiness, the rapid mobilization and deployment of a reinforced frontier force under Jakarta's command, supported by Kechik auxiliaries under the coordination of Faladios, positioned not to attack but to deter, to demonstrate to the world that the Ottoman state was prepared, capable and resolute, and that any aggression against its territories or its people would be met with swift, overwhelming and decisive force. The second pillar was intelligence and covert operations, a significant expansion of Tarhin's network, funded by a dedicated allocation from the state treasury designed to penetrate Shahanshah's inner circle, map his coalition, identify its vulnerabilities, and when the time was right, exploit those vulnerabilities to fracture the alliance from within. The third and most ambitious pillar was diplomatic, a grand outreach to the rulers of every state in the region, proposing not just bilateral agreements but a multilateral framework for cooperation, trade, and collective security that would offer the neutral states an alternative to Shahanshah's coalition of resentment, an alternative based not on fear and hostility but on mutual benefit, shared prosperity, and the common interest in a stable, peaceful, prosperous regional order. The Council approved the strategy with a unanimity that was rare and therefore all the more meaningful, each commander committing to his assigned role with the quiet, determined, absolute dedication of men who understood that the stakes were nothing less than the survival of everything they had built and everything they believed in. As the Council adjourned and the commanders dispersed to their various stations, Arhin remained in the hall, alone, standing before the great map, his shadow stretching across the painted landscape like the shadow of a guardian watching over the land he had sworn to protect. He placed his palm flat against the map, feeling the rough texture of the parchment beneath his fingers, and he closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw not the map but the faces of Boran and Jakarta and Tarhin and Faladios, of Malhun and Nilüfer and Asportia and Fatima, of Gonka and the newborn child whose name was a prayer and whose life was a promise, of the young soldier whose shattered leg would never fully heal but whose spirit had been made whole by a sultan's words, of Yakid whose story had ended in the grey dawn of a winter morning, and whose ghost would haunt the corridors of memory forever, of Damir Khan whose pride had been his poison and whose punishment was the slow, endless torment of reflection, of Shahanshah whose web was still growing, still reaching, still threatening to entangle the world in its sticky, suffocating strands. He saw them all, held them all, carried them all within the vast, aching, indomitable cathedral of his heart, and he whispered into the silence of the empty hall a single word that was not a word at all but a breath, a sigh, a declaration, a prayer, a promise, an oath sworn not to any human ear but to the Almighty himself, the word that contained within its two syllables the entire impossible, magnificent burden of his existence and the unshakable, unconquerable. eternal resolve with which he bore it, the word that was both a question and an answer, both a cry of pain and a shout of defiance, both an admission of human frailty and a testament to divine strength, and that word, spoken in the darkness, heard by no one but the one who hears all things, carried within it the power to move mountains and the humility to kneel before a single sleeping child. And it echoed through the empty hall and through the corridors of the palace, and through the streets of the city, and through the fields and the forests and the mountains and the valleys and the rivers and the seas, spreading outward in an ever-expanding circle of sound and meaning and purpose, touching every soul it reached and reminding them in the quiet, secret language of the heart that the story was not over, that the struggle continued, that the dawn was coming, that the light would prevail. And that as long as there were men and women willing to stand in the darkness and speak that word, to breathe that breath, to make that promise and keep it at any cost, the flame would never go out, the sword would never be sheathed, and the great, rolling, thundering, magnificent river of history would continue to flow, carrying all of them, the living and the dead, the faithful and the fallen, the strong and the broken, toward the distant, shimmering, unreachable, inevitable horizon where all rivers meet the sea and all stories find their end and all souls, at last, come home. Face is still, but she is watching, and she is thinking. She is thinking about Esposa's hands as they rested on the table while she spoke. Competent hands, calm hands, the hands of a woman who has found something to do with herself in a world that initially offered her nothing. She is thinking about the murad and the almost smile. She is thinking about the tray of bread and fruit. She is thinking about the millimeter. The dinner ends. The household disperses. Orhan remains at the table alone for a moment. He sits in the silence of the room after the people have left, the particular silence that always follows a gathering, that carries in it the residue of the voices and the presence of the people who were just there and are now gone. He thinks about what he saw tonight. Not dramatic, not the moment of resolution that songs are made of. Just two women at the same table, slightly closer together than yesterday, slightly less defended, slightly more present with each other. He will take it. He will take every millimeter that comes. He rises. He walks to the window. The city is quieting into its nighttime version of itself, the louder rhythms replaced by softer ones, the commercial sounds replaced. But tonight at the table something is different. Orhan arrives to find Nilüfer and Esposa already seated. Not beside each other, but also not at opposite ends of the table. Somewhere in between. He sits. He looks at them. He says nothing about it. But he notices. And in noticing, he feels something that has been missing for some time. Something that is not quite peace and not quite relief, but that resembles both. The feeling of a thing that was broken beginning to find its shape again. Not the original shape. It will never be the original shape. Something has happened that cannot be made unhappen. The world of this household before Esposa's arrival no longer exists and cannot be restored. But new shapes are possible. Different configurations. Not lesser than the original. Just differenter. The way a bone healed is different from the bone unbroken, slightly thicker at the fracture site, slightly denser, sometimes stronger than it was before precisely because of what it endured. He eats. He speaks about the day. He speaks about Kara Khalil's work in the city. He speaks about the expansion plans. He asks Esposa about the Byzantine trade correspondence. She answers with the precise, competent brevity of a woman who has taken the work seriously and has things of substance to report. He listens. He asks a follow-up question. She answers. Nilüfer watches this exchange. Her face. Someone within the network. Acting independently. Acting against the explicit instruction of the center. Orhan reads this 3 times. He holds it up to the light of understanding. If it is true, it changes the picture significantly. It means the center, the power at the eastern distance, did not send the probe. It means someone within the network, one of the nodes, one of the people who has been connected to the web, has gone beyond their instructions, has used the network for their own purpose, has allowed the web to be used for something the center did not sanction. If it is true, he considers whether it is true. He considers whether it is exactly the kind of message that a center would send when caught, designed to create distance between themselves and an action that went wrong, designed to offer a sacrificial node in exchange for the center's own protection. He considers both possibilities. He holds them both. He does not choose between them yet. He will know more when Evrenos's response to the probe produces a reaction, and he watches who reacts and how. He files the message. He continues. Evening arrives. The call to prayer. The household gathering. The ordinary rhythms replaced by domestic ones, the sounds of transaction and movement replaced by the sounds of families settling into the private architecture of their evenings. He watches. He thinks about the letter. He thinks about the probe. He thinks about the message that arrived through the market. He thinks about which pieces of the picture he can now see clearly and which remain in shadow. The center has not revealed itself fully. Not yet. But it has revealed that it is watching, that it received the letter, that it is making calculations, that someone in the network acted without its permission and has now caused it a problem. The center, wherever it is now managing the consequences of an unauthorized action by one of its own nodes. Which means it is distracted. Which means it is, for the first time since this began, not fully in control of the situation it created. That is the opening, not the letter, not the border response, the moment of internal management that the center is now being forced into. A power managing its own internal disorder cannot simultaneously manage its external strategy with full attention. Orhan has learned this in the palace. He knows it as intimately as he knows anything. When you are managing the tension between two women at the same table, you cannot give your full attention to the frontier. When the frontier demands your full attention, the tension at the table has space to grow. Everything is connected. The personal and the political. The internal, if the response is delayed or uncertain or smaller than expected, they will know the letter was theater and the network's assessment was correct, and the moment to act is now. Orhan stands. He writes a single instruction. He hands it to the rider. The instruction is not complicated. It says respond with twice the force the probe warranted. Not because the situation demands twice the force. Because the audience requires it. The audience that is watching from the eastern distance needs to see a response so immediate and so confident and so significantly larger than necessary that the only conclusion available to them is that the Ottoman frontier is not managed by a distracted sultan struggling with palace politics, but by a ruler who has full command of his resources and his attention and his intention. Let them see it. Let them read it. Let them make their calculation again with the new data and arrive at a different answer. The rider departs. Orhan returns to the room. He looks at the map. He traces the border with his finger. He thinks about the kitchen boy with the water jug. He thinks about two words heard in a corridor. He thinks about a sparrow on a wall. He thinks about the invisible processes that determine the fate of visible things. He thinks about his father standing in a garden telling a small boy that a man who cannot tend what is small cannot be trusted to tend what is large. He has tended the small things. The tray of bread and fruit. The ruling about the farmland. The millimeter between two women in a room. The kitchen boy who was never noticed and therefore noticed everything. He has tended these things with the same attention he gives to borders and armies and political letters and intelligence networks. Because they are the same thing. They are all the same thing. A state is not a collection of large decisions. A state is the accumulated weight of every small one. The afternoon brings another visitor. Not to the palace, to the city. A man who arrives without announcement, who moves through the market district with the careful inconspicuousness of someone who has been trained in the art of arriving in places without being seen to arrive, who finds a specific stall in the lower market and conducts a transaction so ordinary that no one around him would have any reason to remember it, and then departs the same way he came. But the transaction contains a message, and the message finds its way to Orhan Bey by evening. Orhan brings it to Orhan. It is a response, not to the letter. The response to the letter will come through different channels. This is a response to the border incident. It says in the careful, oblique language of people who communicate through intermediaries and must therefore maintain plausible distance from the content of their communications, that the probe was not authorized by the power Orhan believes is at the center of the network. It was authorized by someone else.